Hi, my name is Michael Dennis. I'm with the Green Party of the United States Lavender Caucus, as well as the Youth Caucus. And we're here today to talk about LGBTQIA issues in the Trump era. And with me today is Cynthia Bryan Cate with us via audio to share her experiences organizing in this community and what lies ahead for the next 4 years and onward. So, Cynthia, if you could take a moment and introduce yourself, as well as give us some of your background of what kind of activism and organizing work that you have participated in.
Hi there, my preferred name is Cynthia Bryan Cate. Let's see, I'm a vice chair of the Suffolk County, New York Green Party chapter. I also am a New York board member of Organization Intersex International's USA branch, which is the world's largest advocacy group for people biologically between male and female. I do similar work for Intersex Friends and Families, a group that helps intersex people, friends, families, lovers, spouses, partners, and so forth. I also am a nighttime crisis line operator for the Trans Lifeline, which is a crisis line, suicide prevention, general helpline for transgender and gender nonconforming people done by trans and gender nonconforming people. And I also do a lot of work with the Transgender Day of Remembrance Project, which brings awareness about hate crimes directed against people, targeting people based on their gender, and trying to make a world that's more accepting of people exploring their particular gender identities.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for that. So if you could just maybe give us an overview of, certainly a lot of us in the LGBTQIA community have faced oppression and hardship even before the inauguration of Trump, but certainly we can expect more oppression efforts by these neo-fascists who have come to power both in Congress and in the presidency in the next 4 years. If you could give us an overview of what you think these next 4 years will be like for our community.
I think part of the problem is simply that we don't exactly know. We know that the incoming administration seems to be made up of people who do not have the best interests of the LGBTIQA plus community at heart. We know that some of them have had pretty bad backgrounds on this, yet claim to be saying they're not going to go after us. I think that it's the cliche of hoping for the best and expecting for the worst. I'm not saying that people should run under their blankets in terror, nor do I think that we should be expecting a pride march anytime soon from this administration. I think we should be prepared to stand strong, work on everything we're already working on these issues if we are. If we aren't, we need to work on these issues. And I think that the next 4 years we're going to have more need than ever of everything from basic awareness of what the heck do any of these letters mean, down to preventing really horrible legislation, and hopefully trying to get some better legislation actually to move somewhere.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out as far as what do even some of these letters mean, and many of our viewers may not be familiar with the acronym that the Green Party has adopted in the Green Party's Lavender Caucus, which is LGBTQIA+. So, Cynthia, would you be able to share with our viewers from your own definition what you think people out there on Facebook need to know as far as what does it mean to be trans or intersex?
Okay, so you mean explain what transgender and intersex are? Because let's see, actually I think we should make sure people know what the exact letters are anyway. Okay. LG is lesbian, gay. B is bisexual. T for transgender. Transgender is an umbrella which covers just about all sorts of almost any kind of people who identify as, express, and or live as a gender other than the one that was expected of them at birth. And there's a whole range of identities that fall under that. Let's see. Q is often questioning, though some people use the controversial word queer, which used to be an insult word, now has been reclaimed as a power word and sort of a catch-all by some people. I, for intersex, is referring to people who are biologically in between or outside the medical definitions of male and female, whether by chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, or any of the other sex characteristics. Intersex and transgender are not quite the same thing, but there are many people who happen to be both at the same time. Intersex refers to biological sex, whether you're male, female, or any of the other variations, like I happen to be. T for transgender refers to, as I said, gender identity, where you fall under somewhere other than what you expected to be in terms of your gender, which there's a new word, intergender, for people like me who are biologically intersex but identify as trans somewhere on that spectrum. A can mean either allies or the asexual spectrum, which is a whole separate set of sexual orientations ranging from completely asexual to people who have a sexuality but are not attracted to people in the standard ways that we're expected to in our current society.
Thank you for that.
That's its own spectrum.
And so, I'm really happy that as the Green Party, we have for quite a while embraced that full spectrum. Since our founding in the early 80s, we supported gay adoption and gay marriage, but then as early as 2000, we added both trans and intersex rights to our platform as well. And that's not something that you necessarily find across the progressive left, persons talking about that. So would you be able to share for the TQIA part of the spectrum that people may not be as familiar with, what kind of organizing work have you done around that, and what kind of opportunities may present themselves for people to make some progress on these issues over the next 4 years?
Some of the work I've done has simply been doing 101 awareness work of what any of this stuff means, showing lives of trans, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual spectrum people, not just myself, but friends and colleagues that do this work along with me, both in New York and other states. Some of it has been rallies and protests, either to help advance positive legislation for these communities, or to tell politicians that they need to move forward on them, things like that. So
Wonderful.
a lot of it has definitely meant just explaining to people what a lot of this stuff means, because we are hearing more about a lot of these populations and people. In fact, I think that's one of the things that's in our favor, is that the average person has at least heard of at least a lot of this stuff. More people are hearing about transgender people these days, more and more every day. Every day I leave my house, more and more people tell me, oh, we've actually heard of this. And intersex is starting to be more in people's understanding.
And we've certainly seen that legislation is more likely to, progressive legislation for a community is more likely to pass and be supported when people are familiar with someone from that community or hear our story. So I really appreciate you bringing out that part of the discussion. We're wrapping up shortly here, but I also want to bring in, so you've shared some of your own work that you've done to share what these words mean and share your experiences in this understanding. What can people who are looking to be allies to the LGBTQIA plus community in the next 4 years and beyond do themselves, take the initiative to do to help?
First of all, they should educate themselves, become as aware as they can on this. While I do recommend reading and going on the internet, I also recommend actually attending any open groups that do discussion on gender or sexuality. Obviously not like a closed support group for people who just are, but if there's something like an awareness thing, local LGBT center doing a 101 kind of thing like that, Also, if you hear somebody saying something really unkind or stupid about LGBTIQA plus people, even just saying, dude, that ain't cool, is definitely something that can be done to help. Make it clear to people around you that you support all these communities and populations. If you know of any legislation that's coming down that's bad, tell your legislators not to pass it. If you see something that's good legislatively, tell your legislators to get it to a vote and to pass it. And if you don't see legislation, then you can start bugging your legislators. Why isn't this even being considered?
Well, thank you for your time, Cynthia. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we can certainly have you back on the Green News Network for a more in-depth conversation.
I would love to.
Looking forward to having that conversation with you. Once again, my name is Michael Dennis of the Lavender Caucus of the Green Party of the United States. If you are an LGBTQIA person who is interested in a independent political party that doesn't accept corporate money and has supported our community for quite a while, you can look us up on Facebook or Twitter, on our website, the Lavender Green Caucus. And once again, thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thanks for also being the one party that I know has
A little bit more. Here you go. Give it up for Adrian.
Hi. Thank you. I'm here today because I feel hopeless. I imagine many of you feel that way too. I'm hopeless about civil rights in this country. I'm hopeless about our endless imperialist wars. I'm hopeless about mass incarceration and hopeless about the climate. But the Green Party has given me antidotes to despair. Gail McLaughlin, when she was the Green Mayor of Richmond, California, brought the rate of officer-involved shooting to 0 by applying green policing principles. Gail did what we all know is necessary, using community oversight, de-escalation training, and accountability.
Yeah!
The Green Party of New York State led the charge for a statewide ban on fracking, and it was passed. Our socialist ally, Kshama Sawant, won a $15 minimum wage in Seattle.
Yeah!
This victory gave momentum to the national movement. We need to put Gails and Kshamas in every city. We need a party of the 99%. The Green Party is that party. We need a grassroots party whose power comes from the people. The Green Party is that party. We have the ballot access and infrastructure continue a policy-based resistance. It is time to stop waiting for corporate politicians to help us, actually help us with healthcare, housing, education, and peace. No help will come from them. What we do have is each other. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. Somos los que hemos estado esperando. Thank you, Socialist Alternative and the other organizers. It is an honor to speak up here today. The Green Party stands with all of you against the Trump agenda in solidarity. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
I'm Eric Rydberg. I'm here with two of my water protectors that I met at Standing Rock. If you're unfamiliar with me, I ran for district delegate for Bernie Sanders and joined the Green Party when Dr. Cornel West abstained from the platform. I worked for the Stein campaign as a state coordinator for California, and I spent about a month out at Standing Rock where I had the pleasure of meeting my two water protectors here with me. Here with me is Sarah Machuzak. She was a Standing Rock medic, and also I have Adam Elfers from defundapple.org. So I spent about a month out at Standing Rock. I got to work with the International Indigenous Youth Council, who is here today at the Women's March. We had a rally at Malcolm X Park yesterday. So right now, there's hundreds of thousands of people in the street here in Washington, D.C., and we're here to talk to you guys about Standing Rock, the state of Standing Rock, what has transpired here in the last few months, and what is going to happen in the future. I'd like to introduce Sarah Machuzak. She's a Standing Rock medic. She actually quit her job with law enforcement to be out at Standing Rock to be a medic. She's been out there for about 4 months, and she's planning on going back after Occupy Inauguration here. Also, you're a mother of a 2.5-year-old.
I am.
Which I can sympathize with. I have a 2.5-year-old son at home. So, Sarah, what I'd like to talk to you about is we met the day of the Red Fawn action out at Standing Rock, and a couple days later, it was November 20th, the Backwater Bridge incident.
Yes.
And I'd like it if you could just describe, what happened that night and what that was like from the medic's point of view.
Absolutely. So my role on the Backwater Bridge on the night of November 20th was as our triage station. So essentially, we brought all of the wounded water protectors from the front line about 50 yards back to the triage station where we could get them better care and a little further out of harm's way. I witnessed water cannons being used on hundreds of water protectors for 6 hours in weather that was, sub 20 degrees. Like I said, we had about 300 injuries and 26 people who were taken to the hospital. We treated hypothermia, seizures, even one case of cardiac arrest. We set broken bones, did stitches on lacerations, countless bruises from rubber bullets. I watched as water protectors would come to us with their teeth chattering, their jackets covered in ice because they had been subjected to water cannons for so long. They were hypothermic in a lot of cases and couldn't even tell me their names because of what they had experienced. But as soon as we would get them patched up and ready to go again, they went back to the oppression to continue fighting because that's how much they believe in what they were doing and what they continue to do. I watched people who had been sprayed with pepper spray or mace come to us and get their eyes flushed only to return to the very people who sprayed them in the first place because they have that warrior spirit and that power. They believe in the resistance, and I ask you guys to believe in the resistance as well. Standing Rock isn't going anywhere, and all the water protectors are continuing to fight for our rights and continuing to fight for the water. So I just would love to encourage everyone to remember them, remember us, we're still there, and keep fighting with us and keep praying with us.
So the number there was, I think I heard it was like 167 cases of hypothermia.
Yes, absolutely. That we could confirm that came to us for health.
Gotcha.
Some people are stubborn.
And around 300 injuries. And then out of the 26 people that went to the hospital, this included Sophia Wilansky.
Correct.
Who, if you haven't heard, took a concussion grenade to her forearm, which blew away most of the muscle on her forearm. She's has been able to keep her arm, but she's had many surgeries to do so, as well as the seizure you mentioned, which has happened to one of the youth council, my friend Efren Montalvo, who took a concussion grenade to the chest, gave him a seizure. So they refer to these things as less than lethal weapons. But the truth of the matter is, it wasn't for medics with police and fire training like she has, people wouldn't have been able to survive that night. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for returning to Standing Rock after this is done and
Always.
all that you've done. I want to turn now to my friend Adam Elfers, who's been working with defundapple.org. Once again, another one of my fellow millennials that I met in camp. I think we met on the day of the Red Fawn action out there too as well. And it was a few days after the Backwater Bridge incident that you were telling me that you guys had defundapple.org set up. I seen you on the Young Turks doing an interview, and I think it was like within the first couple weeks of that, it was about $18 million that got divested from the banks such as Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs. So, and I also, you just returned from Sable Trail, isn't that true? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, what has transpired with Defund Apple and what's going on at Sable Trail, and like what are your guys' plans for the future as far as divestment and taking the movement forward?
Well, we'll start with Standing Rock, and Standing Rock is really a movement that has been built upon the covenant of the indigenous-led resistance to protect the water and the sacred land, and the help and the solidarity of allies. And, as every day, as a person that was out on, the front lines as well, since the beginning of August, what we started to see is this sort of corporate-backed invasion, basically, of the land and of the water. And people would stand up for that land and for that water, and yet again and again be brutalized by the police, and yet come with so much passion and conviction. And what we saw through social media, through the internet and the interconnectivity of communication, is that people around the world wanted to stand in solidarity with Standing Rock. They sent clothes, they sent supplies, they sent donations. Standing Rock in a lot of ways was built on this collaboration of the indigenous-led resistance and the support of, allies around the world. And at a certain point, I think many of us in the movement became aware through some research by Food and Water Watch and other organizations that, in fact, the Dakota Access Pipeline was being funded by the major banks, especially the major American banks. And we realized that if we truly want to stand with Standing Rock as allies, it wasn't enough to just sign a petition or to send supplies or even to stand up on the front lines. That on some level, if we wanted to beat the black snake, that we had to quit feeding it. And that meant very clearly that we had to divest our bank accounts from these banks that are using our money without asking us or telling us to fund the Dakota Access Pipeline. And through that spirit of people wanting to truly stand in that way, now in about 60 days, we've divested about $50 million officially through our website, defundapple.org, and in fact, much, much more from that hasn't actually gone officially through our site.
So what you're saying is $50 million has been divested directly through your guys' website that you set up, and that doesn't account for the many, many, many people that have divested not using Defund Apple. So we won't know what the true number is, but at least we have defundapple.org to tell us, look, this is what's happening, and everybody's getting on board. Now, you spent some time at Sable Trail as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on down there in Florida?
Yeah. Right now, there is a pipeline, generally we call it a natural gas pipeline, but the water protectors in Sable Trail educated me that they don't want us to call it a natural gas pipeline anymore. In fact, it's a fracked gas pipeline. It's that gas is being obtained through fracking and transported across the United States, ultimately into Florida. And we want to commend them for their recent civil disobedience in a powerful, strong way to stand against that pipeline. And I think the really amazing thing that we're seeing through the defunding work that we've started with Defund Apple is the same banks that are funding the Dakota Access Pipeline are in many cases funding the Sable Trail Pipeline, and we're starting to make the connections to how they're funding the Nexus Pipeline, Trans-Pecos Pipeline, Diamond, etc. So our vision is to, what started as Defund Apple, we're realizing we're not only defunding the Dakota Access Pipeline, we're defunding a system that extracts the resources of the planet in an irresponsible way to fund a fossil fuel industry which is not sustainable. So our vision is to, as we're talking with a coalition of other nonprofits and indigenous organizations, to form a coalition to defund the entire fossil fuel industry. And as we realize as allies around the world that Standing Rock isn't just a place, it's not just the front lines out there, that we can all bring that movement to the front lines of our own homes, our own backyards where the rivers and the water is in jeopardy, and most importantly, to our own banks. So our vision is to defund the fossil fuel industry and set a precedent that as people, we will not stand for this, and we demand clean energy now, from front line to front line.
Thank you, my brother. As Kashayo Pomo from Northern California, I truly appreciate the both of you being out there, standing up for people. And we just want to say this idea of frontline to frontline, being there for all the pipelines, Diamond, Sable Trail, Algonquin Pipeline in New Jersey, Trans-Pecos, there's one coming through Utah. And in my own backyard in Northern California right now, they're talking about putting a liquefied natural gas pipeline through the Klamath River, where the Yurok, the Karuk, and the Hoopa have finally gotten our salmon population back. We need your help at home and on the front lines to be able to confront this corporate system of destroying our planet for profit. So thank you guys very much for being with us today. If you could go to defundapple.org and also help our International Indigenous Youth Council free their sister who's being held, Red Fawn Phallus. Please go to www.freeredfawn.com. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, and help us move towards a green future where we know that the next 7 generations will have a planet worth living on. Thank you so much.
My name is Renee Holt. I am a member of the Nez Perce tribe of Idaho, but I am also Diné from the With the Rock clan in the Southwest. I'm here at the Sacred Stone Spirit Camp and also the Red Warrior Spirit Camp, not only to honor the relationship with the Hunkpapa, Lakota, and Dakota people that the Nez Perce have had for over the last 100 years. I'm actually here in support of the protection of water and solidarity with indigenous people of the world in the protection of Mother Earth. And I think this really is a call to action for citizens of Mother Earth, because that is what we are in this world, in addition to the indigenous philosophy of being children of Mother Earth, protectors of Mother Earth, the defenders of the land. We're upholding a responsibility to those that are unborn. And I think everybody here that has come to this place, whether they're indigenous from a nation or an ally from another part of the country or another part of the world, this call to action has really brought people together with one heart and one mind. And it's very beautiful to think about that, because there are nations who have been, or who are rival enemy tribes that are coming together, and water is the sole source of that. Water is bringing us together. Water is healing us. And water is uniting us. And as one front, there are many nations.
Hi, I'm Charmaine Barrows. I come from Denver, Colorado. I came out here to Standing Rock, North Dakota, to support the struggle behind the pipelines because we know how important our water is, and we've been fighting for our water most of our lives and our land. Our land was taken away from us, and it's being done over again and again. And so we come together here. We have the first time in 180 years that all tribes are coming together. This is a historical day, and we're just really happy to be here and see the solidarity that people have in the camp. And we know that if we work collectively together, that we can make changes in the world, because we know a better world is possible, and we're doing that here together. And so I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be a part of the process. It's a lot of work, but I think if we work together, we're going to make it, and we're going to make the world a better place.
We shut construction down today, and that's good. That's a small victory on our part, but it's a victory.
It is a victory, yes, and we just have to keep standing up, and your courage is exactly what we need. You're a model for the nation, and I'm appealing to everybody out there listening to come on down. You need to come on over and just help support this movement, because it's all of our water at the end of the day. It's all of our atmosphere. It's all of our climate. We need to be here standing strong and standing together at Standing Rock. Let's stand together at Standing Rock. Let's do it. Yeah.
Woo, 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 woo.
And hi, it's good to be back, and I'm here now with two amazing, incredible guests. We're going to be discussing climate change and environmental justice, and how do we go forward in this new era of the Trump administration, if you can call it that. I'm not sure if they're going to be administrating or just destroying, but you know, there are some challenges. We've been in a period of great challenge, you know, for the long haul here, and now things are about to get much more challenging. So I'm really honored to have these two guests who are both analysts, writers, and deep thinkers, visionaries, and activists who've been doing wonderful work. So we have Anthony Rogers Wright, who is very involved on many fronts, including from healthcare to income inequality to environmental injustice. he helped lead the coalition that shut down the Port Ambrose LNG facility, and this is certainly, a big part of the struggle going forward, stopping these fossil fuel infrastructures, which we should be dismantling, not in the process of building new ones. Great to have you with us, Anthony. And Chris Williams, who is also an environmental activist and a writer, a professor of physics and chemistry, and the author of one of the best-known books about ecology and socialism. So really great to have you both with us. And I thought to get things going here, each of you could say a little bit about your work, what has been your focus, and how does that change now given the struggle that lies ahead? We've seen, for example, that Donald Trump is appointing to his cabinet, as I counted, some 2, 4, 6 people, from Secretary of State through the Department of Justice, Jeff Sessions, through Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Energy, head of the EPA, you name it. It's just an all-out assault. So it's really quite a daunting prospect for what lies ahead. So why don't you, Anthony, get us started for what have you been focusing on? How does this change, and how do we fight back now in the era of Donald Trump?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that, primarily my focus has always been to increase awareness about disproportionate impacts of environmental toxification and climate disruption on communities of color. And, and as well as the placement of infrastructure, as we saw in Standing Rock, and we're seeing in other Native American communities. We've also been seeing this occur for decades in communities of color and low wealth communities. And, it's just a synthesis of so many issues that come with climate change, including racism, sexism, misogyny, economic injustice, and ethnic injustice. And we've obviously been really trying to fight that at the federal level. And when I say the federal level, I don't just include the government, but I also include historically white-led environmental groups, the so-called Big Greens. And I think the way that really has now changed under this Trump regime, quite frankly, is that we're going to have to shift our focus to more local level resistance, regional level resistance. And I think that's a good thing, because it's really going to force the environmental movement as a whole to be a lot more inclusive, because local resistance won't work if all of the stakeholders have had equal say at the table and are not a part of the process. And we just saw that in my home state in Washington, where the defeat of I-732 had a lot to do with a lack of inclusion. So, I'm looking forward to rolling up my sleeves and really getting back to how organizing should be done anyway, which is at the local level, door to door, and bringing people together.
And just clarify, for those of us who haven't been following things closely in Washington, what was it that just was defeated?
So that was essentially a carbon pricing bill, which would have put a price on carbon dioxide emissions. And there were a litany of issues with it. But right off the bat, there was this idea of not necessarily including communities of color. And once the bill was drafted, the age-old get in line, guys, and just basically do what you're told. And that was met with resistance by many local Seattle groups, as well as some national environmental organizations as well.
And so you were able to build a coalition in order to stop this proposal?
Yeah,
the story?
Right. Yeah, various people came together in Seattle to do this. Like I said, it was unfortunate, but I think it also provided some really good lessons of what needs to be done to really address climate change, which is to have a very social justice and intersectional approach.
Exactly, and that the communities that are most impacted need to be not only included, but really leading the charge and helping to define the really truly transformative solutions that we need, and which don't simply fiddle around the margins. So
absolutely, well said. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, wonderful work that you've been doing. And Chris, why don't you tell people a little bit about your work? You know, both of you have been very involved in the communities that are really on the firing line here, whether it's the communities of color that are most impacted in our urban areas. And Chris, I know you've been doing wonderful work with indigenous communities. Most recently, I think, Chris, you were doing work to help lift up the impact of climate devastation on the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, on the Inuit, I believe. So yes, tell people a little bit more about what you've been doing, Chris, and how you see the battle going forward.
Yeah, I spent a month in the Canadian Arctic in Nunavut, working with a community there from Clyde River who've been campaigning and protesting for 3-4 years now against seismic blasting, which has been approved by the Canadian government to go on in their hunting grounds. And this will have devastating impacts on their food supply, which most of which comes from the ocean, comes from the land, because there's one store in their community that charges $6, for example, for a can of Coke. So in a community that the median wage in Nunavut, if you're non-Inuit, is $86,000. The median wage, if you are Inuit in the territory of Nunavut, which is the size of Western Europe, is $19,000. So massive racial disparity, massive amounts of racism historically as well, when you look at the disruption of indigenous communities through the Canadian forcible removal of 80,000 Inuit children into schools and the massive levels of abuse that came from that. So, but they're not only opposing this, and actually it's a historic case because for the first time in the history of the territory, the Canadian Supreme Court is going to hear their case, and actually did so in November, and so it's now ongoing. And this could have ramifications around the world for other indigenous communities because the Canadian Supreme Court is the most cited court in the world. So whichever direction this case goes is going to be pivotal for both sides. And I think it highlights really the way in which Justin Trudeau has been hailed as a green president. He's supposed to be doing all this great stuff, and yet when it comes down to not laying pipelines, which his government also just approved, or not disrupting the life of Inuit people, which he pledged alongside Barack Obama in March, to actually listen to them, to facilitate the improvement of schools, education, employment, etc. In practice, he's doing the opposite. And so very much a mirror image of Barack Obama, because, in 2011, Barack Obama boasted about laying enough oil and gas pipeline to circle the earth and then some. That's a direct quote. And yet he couldn't lay 70 miles of pipeline to go from Lake Michigan to Flint to carry water so that people didn't get poisoned by lead. So we have a huge, gigantic disparity. But now we have Trump in power, which is probably the only thing that's going to make President Obama look like an amazing president. So, they basically decided to do away with the middle people, the politicians, and just put the corporations directly into the White House. We've been told that business people make the best decisions. That's why we have a multi-billionaire mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg. We have Bill Gates running, aid programs in Africa and thinking he needs to step into education. So now we don't have any politicians. We'll just put the corporate heads into the State Department, into the Department of Energy, etc. And we'll have a businessman as president, a racist, bigoted, misogynist as president, who, if he tries to carry out any of the things that he said, he had a 23% portion of people voting for him. So the vast majority of the country hate him, as is evidenced by the millions of people, not just in this country, but around the world, yesterday and today especially, marching for the right of women, transgender, immigrants. I think it's a fantastic outpouring of resistance, the exact opposite of what the Liberals told us would happen if he was elected. So they're wrong again. And I think that the thing is, we are in a state of emergency in many ways, because the breadth of the attacks across all sectors of society against African Americans, against voting rights, against immigrants, against women, against working people, against native rights, means that actually we're going to have to form coalitions. We're going to have united fronts. We're going to have to step up our level of organization, not only with giant marches, but what organizing comes out of those marches. And how do we set up citadels, urban citadels of power, of alternative power, and think about it like that, where we create sanctuary cities that go beyond resolutions, but actually say, when he tries to visit those cities, for example, we have mass protests to kick him out. Just like in 2004, when New York City said no to George W. Bush. I think we have to be thinking on that scale of resistance, and we know that most of the country actually already hates him, and he hasn't even done anything yet. So, as president. So I think we have a lot of power to work with, and it's a question of how do we concentrate it and get it organized and say, now is the time to fight back.
Exactly. And maybe, Anthony, you can jump in as someone who's been very involved in local organizing, including, shutting down this Port Ambrose LNG fossil fuel facility. As someone who's been working on a spectrum of issues, justice issues, from environmental justice to health justice to the right to vote, how do you advise people to plug in? What should people be doing, or what are some of the things that they can consider doing at the local level?
Right. I mean, Chris just hit so many nails on the head there. I mean, first and foremost, I would really encourage people to, instead of giving their money to nonprofit industrial complex organizations who, support a lot of the candidates that Chris was just talking about, despite their support for fossil fuel infrastructure like frack gas pipelines, I would really encourage people to support local frontline organizations who, if you look at all the things that are, unfortunately wrong with our country that Chris is talking about, that you've been talking about, having to do with income inequality, racism, misogyny, and bigotry, you can see that in the nonprofit industrial complex, where frontline groups are getting 98% of the frontline groups are getting 2% of the wealth, and 2% of these so-called big greens are getting 98% of the wealth. There's your income inequality, and that leads to the nomination of people like Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that she got more money from the fossil fuel industry than Donald Trump did. So also at the local level, understand that you have to get rid of this two-party system, because we're just going to keep going in circles with it. And local fronts, local popular resistance means, creating your own parties. Or we're seeing great work with, like, for instance, my city councilwoman Shwama, who is a socialist, and obliterated Democrats in that race because of her ideas and her understanding of what's going on. So local people should, look for alternate parties like the Green Party, like socialist parties, because a two-party system is just not going to work for you anymore. A two-party system that exacerbates this failed experiment of neoliberalism, which is just exacerbated capitalism, which we can't have if we're really serious about addressing climate change, if we're really serious about addressing racial injustice and economic injustice. That system just has to go, and you're not going to find that in a two-party system. So local people, do your research, and yes, think locally by supporting your local frontline, grassroots, environmental justice, women organizations that are really actually going to put more money into the community, rather than, sending people across the country to get pictures for newsletters to get you to send more money to them.
Exactly. And to underscore that point, the popular mythology is that, the Democrats are better than the Republicans on the climate. But in fact, if you look at what was accomplished actually under all of the above, the Obama energy policy that said, yes, let's do some renewable energy, but yes, we can also do some fracking and fossil fuels of all sorts, actually. When you look at the actual consequences, the extraction and emissions from burning that extracted fuel massively accelerated under the 8 years of Obama's administration. And while much of that is being exported, that doesn't undo the damage in any way. And in fact, while the Paris Accords were being much acclaimed, which are voluntary and inadequate, although they are a symbolic step, but actually don't get the job done. At the very same time that the Democratic administration was negotiating those accords and patting themselves on the back for it, you had the Obama administration signing on to the end to the fossil fuel export ban, which was an incredible gift to the fossil fuel industry, and said that they could just continue to massively extract and to just offshore that damage so that it didn't have to be counted as an emissions on the part of the United States. So it's been a disaster. It's been a bipartisan disaster. And yes, it's more explicit. They've made lobbyists obsolete here by directly putting corporations in charge of our regulatory agencies and our branches of government. But this has been a bipartisan problem all along. And Chris, what are your thoughts about local actions here in the U.S.? We're both in Massachusetts now. As I understand, you've recently moved to Massachusetts. There's a lot of fights going on against pipelines. In Massachusetts, we have another battle, actually, that's been going on for at least 10 years, and this is to unleash public ownership of our energy utilities. And in Massachusetts, the public utilities are doing great. They provide energy at far lower cost. They do it much more efficiently, and they're much more inclined to go towards renewables and much more responsive to public sentiment. Yet we cannot expand them because the legislature takes its marching orders. Our overwhelmingly Democratic legislature takes its marching orders from the big private utilities. So we've been unable to expand renewable energy in the way that we should, and community management of that energy. What kinds of thoughts do you have to throw in on local actions, Chris?
Well, there's a whole load of local actions going on today in solidarity with the Women's March in D.C. So there are marches and demonstrations in East Hampton, Northampton, Deerfield, Boston, obviously. A lot of people I've heard saying that this is the first protest that they've ever been on. They're taking their children along to show them how important it is. So, the most recent Harvard poll showing that majority of people no longer like capitalism. Everybody under 50 now doesn't like capitalism. And 33%, according to a poll about in 2012, the Pew poll saying that 33% of younger people favor socialism, whatever they think that is amazing in a country that denies, the legitimacy of anything other than full-blooded, red in tooth and claw capitalism. So unbridled and unrestrained. And so I think that's amazing. I think it's also amazing that the other poll that came out recently showing that 60% of Americans are either worried or very worried about climate change, and they would be willing to pay more taxes for the government to do something about it. They think it's going to personally affect them. I think that is an amazing statistic, because in the media, you always still hear it presented as two sides, as if there are two sides. And so how are Americans, 60% of them, deciding that it's going to affect them, their children, people in other countries, and want their own government to do more about it? It's because they're seeing it in their own lives, and they can make up their own minds about the state of the world and the country. So I think, it's tremendously exciting that there is so much going in our direction. I think one interesting thing, the World Economic Forum of the ultra-rich is meeting in Davos at the moment, Switzerland. And there are three most concerning points where, number one, income inequality. Number two, climate change. And they said that was actually the worst problem. And number three, the polarization in societies where people are moving to the left and to the right. So they don't have any answers to any of those three things because they created all of those three things. And they're all interconnected. And so the fact that they're worried about people coming to get them with pitchforks, I mean, we should be scaring the living daylights out of these people by the scale and strength of our organizing and mobilizing. And I think that means local organizing, but it also means, like Anthony was saying, how do we keep the longer term, bigger picture in mind? Because actually we can't, capitalism requires racism to function just as much as it does economic exploitation. You actually can't have capitalism without racism. It was birthed through that and continues, it changes in features, but is integral to the system. And nowhere is it really more barbarically shown than in the United States with the police killings of unarmed African Americans. So, you know, I think it's a dangerous time. There is a state of emergency, but it's also a very exciting time.
Thank you so much. And just because the clock is ticking here, we have to wrap. But I very much hope to continue this conversation. We are, you know, at a crisis moment, but a crisis is also an opportunity for deep transformative change. And because all of these issues of economic, social, racial, labor, gender, immigrant justice are so intimately connected, we have an incredible organizing opportunity. And I'll say that from being right here in occupied Washington, D.C. right now, the seat of the new empire. The resistance is just palpable on the street. It's very exciting. Hold on to your hats, and I look forward to continuing our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Victor Wallace. I'm very happy to be on the Green News Network. I'm the managing editor of Socialism Democracy, and I'm a board member of the Liberty Tree Foundation. I'm also active. I work with the rootsaction.org website, which is an important vehicle for popular protest. I'm very supportive of the whole effort to build up an independent left political force in the United States. The whole crisis that we're witnessing now is a product of the long-standing interaction of the Democrats and the Republicans. And the sad thing about this past election is that people who were fed up with the status quo, a significant number of those people felt that they had no other alternative but to vote for Trump. The possibility of a different alternative, such as the Green Party or any other party had it arisen, was closed off for them because of the control exercised by the two dominant parties over the presidential debates. And so, and that combined with voter suppression, I think a lot has been published on all that by Greg Palast, and I've tried to follow that. I've written on that for Counterpunch. And I think, though, that the victory of Trump, illegitimate as it is, has galvanized a lot of popular protest, and there's a tremendous wish to take steps that can really make a difference now. And what's lacking so far is just it's coalescing into some kind of organization, that can really be the organization that everyone turns to. And I realize that starting as an electoral organization may be a problem, but starting as mass organizations, you typically have groups working on single issues. So here again, you have an important initiative that the Liberty Tree Foundation is organized, which is what they call the democracy movement, and their democracy conventions, which have been held twice in summers, and there's going to be another one this coming August, a democracy convention, which is going to be held in the Twin Cities, which is an important gathering post for people to try to do the necessary work for developing a major popular organization that can represent the left as an independent political force, and that doesn't have to be constantly looking to the Democrats. I mean, I'm not opposed to working with Democrats under certain conditions. I think a lot of the energy that was mobilized by the Sanders campaign is something very important that we have to build on. We have to maintain friendly relations with the people who are working in that. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the terrific silence of Sanders and of that whole campaign about U.S. foreign policy, U.S. imperialism. So we have to work with them, but at the same time be critical of them. And but they've set an example of how it is possible at this stage, given what's happened, given the terrible conditions that have been created by neoliberalism. It's possible now to have a major popularly supported movement. So the task is for us to build it. And one of the biggest issues, of course, is the environmental issue. And it's good that Sanders at least has emphasized that. But we again have to emphasize that the fighting for a decent environment is inseparable from the fight against imperialism and militarism, which are important parts of the whole struggle. And I've done quite a bit of writing about the environment, and actually some of it's going to be collected into a book pretty soon called Toward a Livable Future, probably, about the politics and technology of eco-socialism, because we want to have a positive alternative. We want to develop an alternative, but at the same time be relating to each of these specific issues as they come up and as people become aware of them. So there's a tremendous amount of work for us to do. I'm glad to see the high level of mobilization that has been reached, and I'm hopeful that with all these gatherings, not only in Washington, D.C., but around the country, the people will get a sense that people who are discontented will get a sense that there's some other alternative, that those of them who voted for Trump, even though they may have voted for Obama in earlier elections, as some of them did, they'll begin to understand that there is really an alternative that is outside these two dominant parties, which have monopolized the sort of media coverage. And again, the independent media is of extreme importance in this whole context. And then organizations like Roots Action come in as a kind of supplement to independent media, of actually translating the media insights into proposals for action, so that people can actually do something and flood the authorities with the necessary message that we have to get out.
I'm here with David Swanson, and we're going to be talking about the peace movement as it relates to the Trump era, and where we are and where we're going forward. Welcome, David. Good to see you.
Great to see you, George.
Yeah. You know, the question comes up as we go forward in this era of fear and trepidation. I look back and I say, well, we were there, you know, when Bush came in, and there was the same kind of atmosphere, maybe not as scary. And we worked through that. Then we came into the hope of Obama and the president of peace that wasn't there and very hollow. And as a peace movement, there's questions as to where we are, but at the same time, our leadership has been working very, very hard. And so as we go forward, I think issues such as nuclear disarmament and where he's coming from and where Putin's coming from, obviously Syria's there, but the big one for me is NATO. And I've heard a lot of discussion in terms of, oh, he's good on this and maybe it's okay. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think, you know, even a dead clock is right twice a day, and, you know, even a fascist is right once in a while. And I think it's important for us to be complex enough in our thinking to recognize that Donald Trump might do something right. He might do it right for the wrong reasons, but he might do something right. And he's guaranteed to do a million things wrong. Same as Obama, same as Bush, same as the ones before. They generally get worse and worse each time, but none of them are 100% evil or 100% good. And so picking, oh, we're going to be on this guy's team or against that guy's team and putting our activism around personalities, cults of personality or cults against personalities, I think ties us up, by, you know, puts our hands behind our back. I think we have to be willing to say to Donald Trump, We're against your racism. We're against your militarism. We're against your sexism. But you want to make friends with Russia and negotiate nuclear disarmament? We're with you. We'll cheer for you. And because here's a guy with a million strikes against him, a million ways to go after him. I'm already part of a movement that's trying to impeach him around his corruption through his businesses, foreign and domestic. But what are the Democrats doing in Washington? The people who found the one candidate who could possibly lose to him and have absolutely no regrets or self-reflection about that are insisting on going after him on the basis of as yet unverified charges, some of them proven false, none of them proven true, that he's just too friendly with Russia. You know, you and I are old enough to remember when, you know, having a U.S. government be friendly with Russia was a dream, you know. Now we've sort of got these leaders on the so-called left in Washington combining this strange package of opposing racism, opposing sexism, opposing fascism, and being in favor of spitting in the face of a nuclear-armed government halfway around the world, which seems to me crazy. So I think we have to be about policy, about principle, and against militarism, but not against the face that's it put on the government, because we might get that guy to do something right. If we box him in a corner, say the only way you're going to be loved or respected is if you attack Russia. I mean, it's the one approach that's going to crumble under any examination because the evidence isn't there, and could very well get us all killed. You know, that being said, he wants to be friends with Russia so he can drill their oil, which is just going to kill us a little more slowly. So, you know, it's not join Trump's team. It's be principled and be aggressive about policy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where, you know, from the organizing standpoint, you know, even with Washington in this conundrum, and it's been in this conundrum, that we have to organize and build the momentum to move the people to affect the politicians. And that's huge in this era of corporate media that's gained billions of dollars behind this last election and that campaign. So that's our task going forward. How do you see this as it relates to what we're talking about, to the military industrial complex and the politicians playing into putting that money into that area and going forward and beating the drums of war?
Well, you know, as you know, and most Americans don't know, military spending is over half of discretionary spending every year. It is the big player in Washington, D.C. It is what drives the permanent government to be pushing this hostility toward Russia because they want an enemy for profit and for bureaucracy and for the inertia of their jobs. You know, it's not that they're against drilling for oil or, you know, some sort of ideological concern. It's about making money. And when you have a guy get inaugurated president and give a speech and, you know, lie that he's for inclusive acceptance of everyone in the United States and against the other 96% of humanity, you know, and, you know, thank you to the world. He opened up with thank you to the people of the world as if they did something to put him in there. Don't put that blame on them. This was the United States screw up. But then he tells them all to go to hell. I mean, he tells the rest of the world it's all about this 4% of humanity and the rest of you be damned. Why? Because then you can turn against the world as enemies. You can bomb them. You can kill them. You can murder them. You can lock them up. And, you know, this is where we need the activism. This is the missing link in all the leftist coalitions, because we've got growing movements against racism, against sexism, against environmental destruction, you know, but where is the movement against the disease that creates the civil liberties violations and the demonization of groups and the leading destroyer of the environment? You know, we need a bigger movement against nationalism, against patriotism, the first refuge of scoundrels. And, you know, this guy is a scoundrel if I ever saw one.
Oh, absolutely. Now I want to pick up the point where you brought up the environment. You know, as we talk about wanting to drill for oil in Russia, and they're drilling all over the place, and we know it's to the detriment of us all. Many of us have been working in terms of climate and the connections to militarism. And I want to say to this audience that the U.S. military is the largest creator of greenhouse gases in the world, that the U.S. military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels. And as we all know and understand that climate change is real, global warming is real, it's a double entendre. It's a threat to our future and our children's future beyond the war and the bombs and the spending. So we've got these two things to deal with. We've got to deal with in other areas. But I think that's so important that we understand that. To me, it's the opportunity to continue to join movements. As we've begun in terms of joining the peace movement with the climate movement. We have to do that with everyone who is here. There are connections as we talk about the border and a U.S. border and migration. We were just down there a couple months ago with the School of the Americas Watch. One of the underlying causes of that migration is climate crisis and the desertification of Mexico and Pan America and the need to move north in terms because those countries have been destabilized and people have to move north for survival or to send money back. Those are things that we want to share with the American public. But so many things are really connected, David.
Oh, absolutely. Climate change is taking out 400,000 lives a year at this point, and that's going to go up dramatically. If we have any success in scaling back war and militarism, which is not clear we will, but we're going to try, at some point climate change will overtake war as a cause of death and destruction on Earth. These are both super important dangers to go after. And, it ought to be seen as something to our advantage as activists that the chief opponent in both of these apocalyptic dangers is one and the same, is the Pentagon. It's spending as much on militarism as the rest of the world put together, the driving force behind arms races and militarism and arming the rest of the globe. None of the countries where the wars are manufacture any weapons. They all come first from the United States and secondly from 5 other countries. And the chief destroyer, as you said, of the Earth's climate, and not just its climate, but its waters and its soil and its oceans. And, the United States would rank 30-something if it were a country. But it's not a country. It's just the United States military. And they're now talking about making bullets that plant seeds and solar-powered vehicles. And we're going to have an environmentally appropriate system of mass murder. Not going to work. Absolutely insane. Has to be turned around.
Oh, absolutely. As we look forward, and we just got a few minutes to go, folks are saying, I have this frustration. I don't know where to go. It seems impossible. And one of the things that I point to is the old, work locally and think globally. And there has been satisfaction the last decade in terms of a local democracy movement. We've seen that in the peace movement as we went to local referendum to bring the troops home and change the posture of the American public here. As we go forward in terms of education, what kinds of things do you recommend?
Yeah, this is what we're working on at worldbeyondwar.org, is going local and going global. That is building alliances across borders, across the globe, where that we can learn from each other's activism and be stronger together, and going locally where we have some form of democracy in the United States, in some localities and counties and states, and building power there. And so there are cities now committing to resist any deportations, any registries, any torture, any abuse of people on the basis of any discriminatory factor. And these cities and towns and counties and states that can stand up to the U.S. federal government with us and stand with the rest of the world. If the U.S. empire is going to fall apart, maybe it needs to start to fall apart in a good way, with states taking more power to do good things, even seceding from this overlarge empire, and if it's Hawaii or California or whoever goes first, I'm going with them, and we're going to try to build a model for something better than what Washington, D.C. has got going right now.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on what you said in terms of working with the rest of the world. As we look at foreign policy, our nuclear disarmament coalition, Peace on the Planet, is meeting on Monday and having a convention. And we're international, 20 countries, and we look to the strength of our allies since we're in the belly of the beast and have lost our strength. We look to working in other movements historically with the United Nations that has begun to make a move in terms of their position on Israel. And so I say to the American public, domestically, let's work locally, let's build our democracy. And in terms of foreign policy, let's look to our allies and let's work hard with our movements and bring them together.
Yeah, this is what we're doing at World Beyond War, where we're forming chapters and leaders directing us from around the globe, not just from within the United States. And we have places like the Netherlands that are pushing to get the U.S. nukes out of Europe while the U.S. is trying to get more in. And we have the non-nuclear nations now moving for a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And there's going to be a meeting opening in New York at the UN on March 27th to work on this treaty to ban nukes, which, of course, goes way beyond where that corrupt and handicapped organization, the United Nations, wants to go, but it is where the world has to go. And if Trump takes any sort of weird partial steps in that direction for crazy reasons, we got to encourage him. We got to reward him. I mean, he's a child. He needs positive attention and reinforcement when he gets anything right, and he needs it shouted from the rooftops, even while we stand on principle against the horrible, destructive things he's going to be doing at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. And just as we're signing off here, we all know, and I've seen this phrase on 5 continents from indigenous people, that the little ants can chop down the big oak tree. And we've done that historically in terms of our movements. We
Welcome to our discussion of civil liberties and the surveillance state. With me, I have Ray McGovern. Ray is a veteran. He was an Army officer, and in 1990, he retired from the CIA, where he was a CIA analyst. We also have Sue Udry. Sue is the executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and Defending Dissent Foundation, and Sue is a longtime friend and colleague. I'm first going to turn to Ray. Ray, with your history of both being in the military and being an analyst for the CIA, what can you tell us about the current state of civil liberties and the surveillance state, even before yesterday's incident?
Well, the current state, and even before, is not good. Okay, we Army officers and CIA analysts took one oath, and one oath only, and that was to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when we see how our Constitution, and specifically the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, have been shredded, we're speaking out. Torture, that's another thing that we were not used to seeing being indulged in by our country. And I'll have a couple words to say about that, because that seems to me the supreme deprivation of civil liberties, when you take somebody and you treat a person inhumanely like that. Human beings don't do that, or are not supposed to do that to other human beings.
Sue, would you say that we, the United States of America, and the people that live here, and especially younger people, are being conditioned to accept a new normal where things like torture are accepted as okay?
I'm afraid we are, George, and I think that that's something that the movement is really fighting against the normalization of Trump's brand of dehumanizing people who don't look and sound and think like him. But we can't put the blame only on President Trump, sorry. President Obama did a lot to really increase the surveillance state and to normalize this condition of the government has the right to oversee every part of our lives. The government has the right to create a kill list. That was President Obama who created that, and now we're all looking at a situation where Trump can decide who goes on this kill list. What American citizen does Trump think has so deeply offended him that they deserve to be killed? And that's something that President Obama instituted. So yeah, it's a frightening state of affairs.
It is a frightening state of affairs, and knowing that Obama started that list and now another administration from a different party, political party, is carrying it on, means it's not a partisan effort. Undermining our civil liberties apparently is something that is a bipartisan practice. Ray?
You know, I'd like to introduce a very brief clip here, which shows what we're facing. I have a history with the person with whom I was discussing this. His name is Pete Hoekstra. He was the head of the House Intelligence Committee, and after the CIA had to give up documentary evidence of how it had tortured people, and after Dianne Feinstein, to her credit, the Senate Committee Chairman on Intelligence, released this, we had a little conversation, which I'd like to expose folks to today. It's just 2 minutes.
The agency to go take steps and put in place programs that were designed to catch the bastards who killed 3,000 of us on 9/11 and to make sure it didn't happen again. And that's exactly what they did. I think that what needed to be done was done. I think we were perfectly justified in doing it, and I'd do it again in a minute.
He'd do it again in a minute.
Well, he is, you know, the éminence grise. He was the power behind the throne, and he was responsible for ordering all this. Now, he talked about the dark side, right? And waterboarding he described as a dunk in water. He was running this thing and telling George Tenet, the head of the CIA, what to do. I don't know if he checked with you, Congressman Hoekstra. He really should have, but I'm amazed that you were either unaware of these things or whether you condone them.
I think I've been very open.
So you condone them? My God.
Like I explained this to you. Members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, leadership on both sides, Gang of Eight,
torture was okay?
Thought that the enhanced interrogation techniques were appropriate.
Let's not use these sobriquets.
No, the Justice Department did not characterize these as legal.
Alberto
They
Gonzalez.
characterized them as legal. But, you know, to say that you're aghast that we heard, no.
I'm aghast that you were briefed on it. I thought, you're supposed to be overseeing these things. You should stop these things.
That's why we were briefed on these things.
You were co-opted. That's what you were.
No, we were not. Republicans and Democrats were fully briefed on these programs, and we agreed with them, and we had the opportunity.
You were lied to, and you're ashamed to admit that you were lied to.
I'm not ashamed that I was lied to. I'm admitting that these programs were briefed to us. I've talked with my staff, and going back and said, you know, after this revelation came out, it's kind of like, how much of this program, how much of what is in this Dianne Feinstein report, this partisan report, Democrat report, how much did we know? 90 to 95%.
Oh my God, what a terrible admission. Aren't you ashamed?
No, I'm not ashamed.
My God.
I reached a different conclusion.
You were chair of the Intelligence Committee in the House, and you condoned that.
Your colleagues
These are not my colleagues. These are thugs.
These are people you walked away from.
They're thugs.
These are heroes for America.
Gentlemen, thugs headed by Dick Cheney.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to. We're going to have to hold it right there. Thanks so much for you for joining.
I hope that it's fairly clear from that clip what we're facing. This was the head of the House Intelligence Committee who was supposed to be overseeing what the CIA was doing. It got so bad that in the spring of 2006, I returned the substantial medallion I was given at retirement for commendable service to Mr. Hoekstra. And I said, I don't want to be associated with an agency involved in torture. 3 months later, I found out that he inserted into the National Defense Authorization Bill for that year a provision whereby I could be denied my salary, not my salary, but my pension, if I spoke out in untoward ways. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a guy from Holland, Michigan. where Betsy DeVos is from, where Eric Prince is from, where they style themselves as real good Christians. They want to make sure that God's kingdom is advanced, but apparently that includes waterboarding and other enhanced interrogation techniques.
A bit troubling. So what's on the horizon, Sue? What can people do to build resistance and to create conditions where we're all safe?
Right. Well, I think that we need to not stop paying attention to what this president is planning to do. He said he wants to bring back torture, and we need to be cognizant of that, even though many of his nominees claimed that they would not torture even, and they can't imagine him even asking them to torture. But I think that to build the movement, we've got a golden opportunity right now in our cities and counties and states to pass local legislation to sever the ties between local police and federal law enforcement. So a lot of people have been talking about sanctuary cities and sanctuary counties and sanctuary schools, saying that their local police are not going to enforce immigration legislation. But we've also got this concern about the Muslim registry. And right now we know that the FBI targets Muslims for surveillance and for entrapment and enticing vulnerable people into terrorist plots. So I think that it really behooves us to concentrate on making sure that our local police don't enforce federal, don't work to entrap and surveil and infiltrate Muslim communities or activist groups, because President Trump is no fan of dissent.
No, that is a fact. How do people get started doing that, though? If I'm a high school student or a college student, or I'm active in my church social justice group, what's step one?
Well, I'd love for people to reach out to us at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Our website is bordc.org. That's Bill of Rights Defense Committee. But you also need to reach out to your local elected officials and start talking to them, particularly if you're in a, quote, blue city or county. Those people are saying they want to that they want to fight Trump. Well, they've got to put their money where their mouth is, and they need to pass real solid legislation that ensures that they are not complicit in the Trump repressive agenda.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add that if you're in a place that feels, I don't know the colors, the blue or the red, I don't know which one might be more conservative than another, but generally places that say that they're super conservative, as Ray said, that where the DeVos is from, very Christian. I don't know that you said a word before Christian, I don't remember it. But if someone says that they're moral and they're ethical, they don't believe in torture, they don't believe in shooting black and brown kids, or they don't believe in detention centers and deporting people. So hold them to their own principles. And that's one way to talk to people, is to say, this meets your principles, do the right thing.
Yeah, and I would add that for those of us who consider ourselves well-educated or intellectuals or writers or whatever, we have a big advantage if we have the color hair that I do.
And the gender that you do,
well,
and the color skin that you have.
I mean this facetiously. What I'm saying here is that Americans don't like old people to get beat up, okay? Mm. Young people, no problem, they got it coming to them. Old people like me, they get beat up. Hillary Clinton hears about it. I was beat up 5 yards in front of her, okay? What I'm saying is this. Cesar Chavez, one of my heroes, he used to say, look, speeches are really nice, articles, they're great. But you know what? Without action, nothing's going to happen. So I think we need to put our bodies into it. I think if we have this advantage, we need to show the young people some good example as to how we used to do things, and not just sit back and write letters or write pieces or talk nice to college students.
Very good. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back, and welcome to this section on recounts and voting justice and the fight for fair elections. So in this first discussion, we are going to be talking about the recount and what happened, where it stands, how we go forward from here. And in a nutshell, coming out of this most bitter and divisive election, where 80% of people said they were disgusted by the election, 90% said that they had lost faith in our political system. We had the opportunity to actually look at the vote count in 3 states that had red flags for odd results, for voting irregularities. And that was the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And the question that the recount asked was essentially, do we have a voting system in these 3 states that we can trust? A system that is accurate, secure, and just, and free from Jim Crow kinds of bias in our elections. And what we found was just a spectrum of obstructions and interference, which was political, cronyism, administrative, bureaucratic, and financial, including outrageous costs of millions of dollars in order to have the right to simply be assured of our vote. When you take money out of a bank, the teller will count the money once behind the counter and then count it again in front of your eyes. If there's question about a play in a sports game, you can get an instant replay and re-examine exactly what happened. Because of some very surprising indicators in each of these 3 states, there was great interest in redoing that vote count and ensuring that it was accurate. And we discovered along the way some very interesting findings. So we have on the phone with us Carl Romanelli, who is an election activist, a voting rights and voting justice activist in Pennsylvania, which was one of the 3 states where this recount was launched. Welcome, Carl, who's joining us by phone. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Okay, Carl? Great.
There's power in a factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union.
Hi, it's Jill coming back to you, and I'm not sure how much of our introduction you got before. We had a little bit of a technical snafu here with our microphones. So I will just briefly summarize that I have with us today 3 of the leaders of the recount effort from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. We had launched a recount following this very divisive and bitter election in 3 states where there were some suspicious findings, where the machines were all extremely fallible and had particular problems associated with those machines in each of the states. And we were very fortunate that so many people stood up to make a recount possible. Essentially, on Thanksgiving weekend, over 161,000 donors came forward on very short notice to make small contributions to enable a recount to go forward, to ask the question, do we have a voting system that we can trust, which is accurate, secure, and just? And in addition to 161,000 people coming forward and pitching in, we had thousands of people in each of the states who stood up to say, this is a right of democracy, this is a sacrament of democracy, that they wanted to be a part of this and to participate in the recounting of the vote and the exercise of our fundamental constitutional right to vote and to be confident in that vote. And when we asked, do we have a voting system we can trust? What we found in each of the 3 states was no. In fact, this recount was obstructed by cronyism, by political maneuvering, by legal blockades, by bureaucratic and administrative complexities, and by financial costs that were just absolutely off the charts. So this effort continues, this fight for a vote that we can be confident in. And in each of these 3 states, there are exciting efforts that continue to go forward. So we have here on the line with me right now one of the activists from the recount, Carl Romanelli in Pennsylvania. Carl, why don't you take it away? We're a little short on time because of our technical snafu, but if you could summarize in, say, 5 minutes or less. No, I'm getting the signal 3 minutes for you to summarize. What were the obstacles that appeared in Pennsylvania, and where do things stand right now?
Okay, quickly. In Pennsylvania, the obstacles, just like ballot access, lie within the law, which in order to recount the state, we would have had to see 27,000 individual affidavits filed, 3 from each of over 9,000 voting wards. So it was a difficult process, and without getting into details on the law, there are also moving targets with regard to dates from county to county. So it's already a structurally difficult situation to begin with. But in Pennsylvania, we have the advantage of approaching the recount from various levels. So we did have recounts requested in a number of counties throughout the state. Many of these, most of the recounts was just a mere reiteration of unverifiable numbers. We uncovered anomalies. Probably the most glaring is in Montgomery County, a suburban county outside of Philadelphia, where there were over 4,000 votes in which individuals were registered as signing in to vote on election day, but cast ballots for 0 candidates. So 4,000 people in that county decided to go wait in line at the polls, sign in, and then vote for no one. Obviously, it's an anomaly, and the structural difficulties we talked about didn't allow us to count there and other places. However, we also approached from a legal perspective in asking for relief in federal court in an attempt to get access to the coding and a forensic audit of Pennsylvania machines or a sample of those machines. And we made those requests, we meaning the recount effort, on constitutional grounds. So we can proceed in federal court, which is an amazing driver's seat to be in, because normally with election and recount issues, you have to first run the gamut of a lot of state courts first and deal with the partisanship that you face on a state level. So we're very thrilled that there are aspects of the federal court case that are moving ahead, as well as the harnessing of the energy we've had since the recount in working toward reforms and having verifiable votes in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl, for that very detailed and informative follow-up. And I will just add one other thing that some people may not know, which is that Pennsylvania relies on these extremely fallible, error-prone, unaccountable, untransparent voting machines, these touch-screen machines that have no paper record whatsoever. So there is no paper trail, no means to actually verify, how your vote was recorded. And no means
in 50 of 67 counties, yes.
Exactly. So
and in the count, I just want to add, in the counties where there is paper, the computerized scanners are old and defective. So there's many issues that we certainly need more than 4 or 5 minutes to make people understand. But there is one takeaway I want folks.
Wrap for us in just half a minute here, because we're
yes,
low on time. If you can
yes.
Quickly.
This is a fight that is not finished, and this is not a fight that was easy to undertake. And for your leadership in this struggle and what this represents historically and moving forward, there are many of us who are grateful for your courage and your steadfastness. Thank you, Dr. Stein.
Thank you. And I'll just underscore that Pennsylvania in many ways is sort of a poster child of everything that is wrong. Everything that could go wrong with the voting system is wrong and not functioning in Pennsylvania with regard to the fallibilities. So the potential to bring this to a court and to potentially make Pennsylvania a model for how voting should be structured and assured that it is secure, transparent, accurate, accountable, all that would be really quite amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. We'll continue, stay on the line while we finish. No, actually, I guess we can't keep you on the line, but we will continue this conversation. So I look forward
Yes, let's have an in-depth.
Thank you so much. Take care. All the best. And we're going to turn right now to George Martin, who's here with me in the studio. And thank you so much, George, for being here and for leading the charge in Wisconsin. And tell us, if you can, quickly, and we are low on time.
I will be very quick. We filed for a hand count. The Wisconsin Election Commission gave the option to the counties. The judge determined that it was the right thing to do as a hand count, but he could not see it legally within the Wisconsin laws. We proceeded knowing the outcome. In the counties that did a hand count, there was human error. In the counties with the machines, it was very similar. Our machines in Wisconsin are illegal in California. We were not allowed to test before and after a run, and I'll give you an example. In Brown County, a very large county, the same batch of votes was won 3 times with 3 different totals. And also in the large conservative counties, there was an overvote in thousands. in urban counties that by machine vote, we still don't know what happened. And there's this very suspect to voter suppression. And we continue on. The totals were submitted, but the recount is not over because the counties have not submitted approved minutes. That makes it very difficult to really analyze it. It really comes back to the machines themselves. We are pursuing forward in terms of suing for those machine program tapes, and at the same time, our Wisconsin Green Party has started a campaign called Count My Vote Wisconsin. Within the next 18 months, we will go county to county on referendum to seek a hand count in each county individually.
Incredible, wonderful. And I'll just really hand it to Wisconsin for being so intimately involved and to have a number of citizen-based groups that are working on this issue and have launched this group, this nonpartisan group called Count My Vote, in which the Green Party is playing a key role, but you're working with several other voting justice organizations to keep this moving forward. Thank you so much, George, and to the people of Wisconsin. And we have now on the phone with us Anita Bell, who is an activist in Michigan, who stated at our press conference in Detroit that voting in Detroit, I think you said, Anita, was a hot mess. And it got a lot of resonance, that sort of summed up what was going on with our voting system. So describe a little bit of that hot mess that was going on there in Michigan.
Oh, yes. Detroit is a hot mess, but I called all of Michigan a flaming hot mess because it was not just going on in the city of Detroit. It was going on all over the state. So, yes, I worked with the recount here in Wayne County being the city where being the county where Detroit is the county or seat or the largest city in the county. So we had the recount here, and I worked with that and found, of course, that 60% of the votes from the city of Detroit could not be recounted. And under Michigan law, what that means is that there are usually three totals. The first total is the total of votes that are on the ballot books, or the voters that actually signed the poll book. Then the second total is the machine total from the optical scanner. And the third total is the number of physical ballots that are supposed to be in a locked and sealed ballot box. Well, if those three totals do not match, which means any accountant would say if those three totals don't match and it was a bank, that would be a problem if we were handling money. But for some reason, it's okay if you're handling votes that it's off one or two in the city of Detroit. But also under Michigan law, that means you can't recount them. So my question was, if you can't recount them, how did you count them the first time? Because those totals did not match. It should be that the same number of people who signed the poll book also voted in the election, and that's what you have a total on the voting machine, and you also have physical ballots that match all of those totals. 60% of the time in Detroit, that did not happen. That's a hot mess. But it's also a hot mess when it's not just one or two off, you're talking about hundreds off. So that in precinct 152, you had 307 people vote according to the poll book. 307 people vote according to the machine ballot total or the calculation. But only 50 ballots are in the sealed and locked ballot box. How do you get that kind of hot mess happening? That's Detroit. But in a place like Gibraltar, the locked and sealed...
One more minute, Anita. Just if you can give us one more minute before we run out of time. Carry on.
Oh, yes. 1 more minute is in a city like Gibraltar, which is a small city in Wayne County. The ballot box wasn't even sealed and locked properly. They used duct tape.
Amazing.
Duct tape.
And if I can just credit you with one other very important finding that never would have come to light had you not been doing the recount there, was that 87 of the optical scanners in Detroit actually failed. They broke down on election day, which made the point that these machines that are supposed to be reliable and equitable, they preferentially break down in communities of color and low-income communities. Why is that? It's because these machines require a lot of maintenance, they require care, they require very careful calibration, and under-resourced communities will have disproportionate problems with these machines that will wind up either not counting their votes or miscounting their votes. So it's another example of Jim Crow in our elections, which the U.S. Civil Rights Commission actually told us that if you are voting in a community of color, the odds that your vote will not be counted or will be miscounted are 900% increased in a community of color. So just to wrap, because I'm getting the wrap sign right now, thank you so much, Anita, for your report back and for your wonderful and continuing work. Same to you, George, and to you, Carl. And this battle is not over. We were extremely fortunate to have the support of so many people who contributed and who put in their time and their blood, sweat, and their tears into this. We have raised up this issue of our voting system, which needs to be accurate, secure, and just, and free from Jim Crow in our elections. So thank you all so much for being a part of this. The movement continues, and our discussion will also continue on this channel in weeks to come. And for those who are watching, stand by, and we are about to have a conversation now with another leading voice in the area of election justice and integrity, and that is with Greg Palast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Take care. So, welcome everybody, and welcome to Greg Palast, investigative reporter par excellence, and a true leader in election integrity. And you've been doing this work for a long time. We've just had an election that, shall we say, there's a whole lot of controversy about. Was it the Russians? Was it some leaker? Was it Guccifer? Who done it? Tell us, investigative reporter with a hat on.
Who done it was Trump done it. This election, you know what? It's real simple. For those who don't know me, by the way, this is Greg Palast. I report for Rolling Stone magazine. I'm an investigative reporter. You can tell by the hat, and I also have reported for many years for BBC Television and the Guardian newspapers of Britain. And I do old-fashioned investigative reporting. My big beat has been to some extent on vote heists. Unfortunately, it's happened too often in America, and I think this time we saw it again. We saw it again. And when I say again, back in 2000, I uncovered how thousands of black men were removed from the voter rolls because they were called felons, criminals in Florida. Not one was guilty of any crime except voting while black. That's what elected George W. Bush our president. Not the voters, but a trick to remove black voters from the voter rolls. It happened again in 2004 through all kinds of other more elaborate tricks. We call them caging. I uncovered that with my co-writer investigator for Rolling Stone, Bobby Kennedy Jr. And now here we're back. We've got new tricks and new gimmicks, and we don't need the Russians. Let me tell you, the Republican Party of Michigan, of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Kansas, North Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arizona, these guys don't need Russian help to figure out how to remove votes and voters. We have a problem in America. We don't count all the votes, and we don't let everyone vote who's legally entitled to their vote. It's not a pretty system, and the rest of the world is horrified. I know Joe Biden said that the rest of the world envies our electoral system. Well, I guess he's only been to Kazakhstan. Because I can tell you that in Britain, where I report, in Germany, in Buenos Aires, they are laughing at our system, and they're also afraid of the results. And Trump was not elected. He was not elected by the popular vote. Yeah, we all know that. But he didn't win in Michigan. He didn't win in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and other swing states. He didn't win actually win the vote in those electoral swing states. And some of your work, Dr. Stein, in arranging for what we call the recount, exposed some of this. One of the things we found that you helped uncover in Michigan was that Trump only won by 10,700 votes, but 75,000 votes, 75,355 votes to be exact, were not counted at all. So when you called for the recount, it was actually what you're really doing there, and what was the great public service, was to count those 75,000 votes that weren't counted in the first place, and then they stopped you. The GOP stopped the count in 59% of the precincts in Detroit, and then the court stopped you. Now, here's what we were finding in that recount, and you were finding, I was finding. Those 75,000 votes were votes that the machines could not count because the machines were broken, they were crappy, they were cheap, and they were given to black precincts in Detroit. So those are votes of black voters, poor voters in Detroit and Flint, Michigan. They didn't vote for Trump. Those 75,000 votes held the presidency for Hillary Clinton. Now, a lot of people are not aware that your recount was halted by the courts, in part because of Hillary Clinton. They said, that the aggrieved party is Hillary Clinton, because she's the one whose votes were stolen. But it's not true. I disagree. It's the voters' votes that are stolen, not Hillary Clinton's. But she didn't step forward, and therefore that was the end of that recount. Wisconsin was a fake recount. Votes similarly missing in Milwaukee, where people were not allowed. Their votes were simply not counted because of bad machines in Milwaukee. It's another African-American city. Again, Trump's loss was sitting in those votes never counted. The so-called recount was just taking the same ballots, running them through the same machines, and having the same result. It was like as if they made you bet on an instant replay. You knew how it was going to come out. And Pennsylvania, of course, you were blocked again. I'm telling you what you know, but I want to make sure people know this. There was no recount. That's nonsense. There was no audit of that vote. And if you had counted every vote in America, we would have a different president right now. It's not because I'm for or against Hillary Clinton. It's just not my business. I'm a reporter. But one thing I'm not is a repeater of the nonsense. And then I also like it. Well, you see behind me a movie chart, a movie poster. That's from my movie, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, which was an investigation on how Trump was going to steal the election. We put it out 2 months before the election. I knew what he's going to do. I've been doing an investigation for Rolling Stone. We were finding that. We found a system called Crosscheck, which you've talked about. It would be sure nice to see other candidates, the other candidates for president, talk about this. I know Trump wouldn't because it was put together by the Trump team. This was a system to remove just about 1 million voters of color from the voter rolls by accusing them of the crime of voting twice. They're always doing this. They're always saying black people vote twice. Illegal aliens swim the Rio Grande to vote in our elections. In fact, in my film, I show a little spaceship with aliens pouring out of the spaceship wearing sombreros that say Viva Hillary on them. And, it's a joke, but it's not funny because they've removed so many voters of color on the false accusation that they are not Americans. They don't, but the only one that, in Florida, for example, they try to remove 181,000 voters as illegal aliens. These were Puerto Ricans who had moved to Florida, who are American citizens, have the right to vote. None of them committed this crime. They tried to remove 181,000 of them. None committed the crime. One single person was arrested as an illegal alien voter in Florida, a Republican from Austria. This is what's happening in this country.
And as your work has shown, there are so many ways that voters are suppressed. Vote suppression, the denial of the right to vote, through stripping of the voter rolls, through cross-check, through felon disenfranchisement. And what we found out in our recount, that is the recount that was stopped, the aborted recount, what we learned was that the voting machines themselves fail in a differential way, so that the voting machines, they're not maintained, they're older, they are not properly calibrated, so they are likely to either break down or to simply make mistakes. And the recount was an effort to identify those mistakes and fix it, and the recount was essentially stopped. And yes, what we do know was that the Republicans had a lot to do with this, but what I hear in Wisconsin was that it was Democratic election boards as well, and Democratic administrators. And we know that in the Bernie Sanders, losses, the stripping of voter rolls, for example, in Brooklyn, some tens of thousands. The votes that were not counted in California, we again see that this is a bipartisan problem, and this is a crisis that both parties are fighting to just sweep under the rug as fast as they can. They want to blame the Russians, and in fact, the Democrats, are really pushing this narrative in particular because they need to blame it on someone. God forbid anybody should look to the Democratic Party and its strategy of lifting up these crazy Republican candidates and pushing them out into the media, thinking that that was going to make Hillary's win easier. And in fact, that was part of what was revealed that was so damning. It wasn't the hack, it was more, or the leak, whatever it was the content of those leaks. So, just to make the point, this is a bipartisan problem here, which we got to fix. Give us the last couple of thoughts here in the few remaining minutes that we have.
Well, number one, you better know who the thieves are. That's why I've named the perps in my film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. It's still, by the way, available free today on the 21st. Greg Palast Investigates, my Facebook page. You can get a usual Vimeo, Amazon places. But the important thing is we have to make counting all the votes a commitment no matter what the party. Because here's something very, very important. This is the key thing. We talk about the votes that are counted, and the term that they use is spoiled in the vote biz. The chance your vote will spoil is 900% higher if you're black than if you're white. We still have Jim Crow elections in the United States, and your work, Dr. Stein, is really revealing that. It's not just funky, games they can play with the computers and the machines. We have really old-fashioned, very ugly Jim Crow tactics, and unfortunately, the Democratic Party which should be the natural defender of voters of color, is not stepping forward. So glad you are. And I will always do that as a reporter in a nonpartisan manner. And I think that that's our next big fight. Believe it or not, we're back to 1965. Jeff Sessions is going to be the Attorney General. So we're going to move from a Justice Department to an Injustice Department. So let's get together. You go to gregpalast.com. You go to your sites. Thank you so much for helping me get the word out about voter disenfranchisement, a fancy term for they're stealing the vote. Trump stole it.
And thank you for leading the charge. And we have a right to vote, and we have a right to have an accurate, secure vote that we can be confident in, a voting system that we can trust. And we're going to keep fighting to make that happen, because until we can do that, we cannot, how in the world are we going to fix all the other things that are crashing in around us right now? We got to start with a vote that we can believe in. And thank you, Greg Palast, for leading the way.
You're very welcome. Novel idea. Great.
One. Howdy, folks. You're back to the Green News Network presents Inaugurate the Resistance. Remember, the revolution may not be televised, but it will be live streamed over the Green News Network, because we are making a play for real power. We're talking about building a genuine movement for democracy in the United States of America. It is my distinct pleasure to be joined by two people I've been rolling and working with for a long time. Here in studio, George Martin. You all look so much alike.
Oh, that's okay. I'm honored to be called George.
George Martin, who is in this conversation representing both the Wisconsin Green Party and the Recount Experience, and a fellow with the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution. Joining us on Skype, Caitlin Saposi-Belknap, National Director of Move to Amend, the campaign for a constitutional amendment to abolish in its entirety the idea that corporations are persons with constitutional rights. Here's how I'd like to do this short conversation. George Martin, I want you to share a little bit about this idea of building a democracy movement, why you are finding yourself working in Liberty Tree and in the Wisconsin Green Party.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I've never belonged to a political party since the Black Panther Party. I've never felt at home, within the two major parties. And we as the Green Party are considered one of the four major parties in the United States and don't get that play. So as we go forward, coming from the black community in Milwaukee, as we have had our struggles in terms of our vote and our role in our state, which has gone backwards, all the more important that we gather and go forward in unison, but also in terms of the reforms that are necessary.
Fantastic. So, George, I'm going to ask another question before I bring Caitlin in. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the experience that you had in Wisconsin, not only during the general election cycle, but that recount struggle and why that was such an important fight to fight.
I'll tell you, since the change of administrations from Democrat to Republican, we have been under the worst conditions in terms of voter suppression, voter ID, redistricting. And it's been a struggle that's brought tens of thousands of people to our state capitol for over a year. That being said, it continues, and as it continues, we're working together and rolling forward. This last election, unbelievable in terms of what happened, but as we look back at it and moved into recount, it was very clear that our vote wasn't being counted. And what came about was a nonpartisan effort to make sure that our votes count. And so we have moved forward in that fashion. As a leader in the Wisconsin Green Party, we have taken up this mantle to work on a nonpartisan basis to change things in our state.
So, Caitlin, I want to bring you into this conversation because the idea of amending the United States Constitution, for some people, that seems outside the scope of democracy because we're taught that democracy is voting. So I'm going to challenge you to make the case. Why is the Move to Amend effort to abolish corporate constitutional rights such a democracy issue?
Well, first, let's explain what corporate constitutional rights are, because that's very key. Corporate constitutional rights is the idea that corporations can assert their constitutional rights in a court of law. And so if a community passes legislation to ban fracking, or Congress passes a law to restrict campaign spending to make it more fair, or passes a law to give health care to all, corporations with a lot of money, and those are the only ones that actually assert their constitutional rights, can sue the government, whether we're talking local, state, or federal, for these laws meant to further democracy or well-being for communities and the American public. They can sue these over the legislation and assert that their constitutional rights are violated. So we've seen that in the case of Citizens United. Today is the 7th anniversary of Citizens United, a case where the Supreme Court struck down Congress's attempt to regulate campaign spending. We've seen the Supreme Court give corporations a constitutional right to freedom of religion under the First Amendment, striking down provisions in the Affordable Care Act that that mandated that employers needed to provide birth control and contraception support for their employees, and saying that if the owners of the corporation are Christians or some other religion that doesn't believe in birth control, then the corporation has those same constitutional rights and has freedom of religion. And so what it means is that we are blocked from passing legislation or regulations meant to protect us from some of the most powerful entities in the world. And so the way that we talk about it is, in effect, it renders democracy illegal, because we're always at risk for when we pass groundbreaking legislation to protect our communities, to protect workers, to protect the environment, to protect local businesses. All of those laws can be struck down if corporations can claim constitutional rights. So it gets in the way of making democracy possible and limits our possibilities. And so we're not going to really be able to have real democracy, especially not economic democracy, if corporations are allowed to assert constitutional rights. And the only way to roll that back, because the Supreme Court has made their position very clear for the last 125 years, is through a constitutional amendment.
So, Caitlin, I really appreciate you bringing up the Citizens United anniversary, this being the 7th year of that horrific decision. It's also worth pointing out that today there is a Women's March on Washington. And I want to shout out to the Move to Amend organizers, because I saw them out in the streets passing out a very powerful bit of literature that was comparing women's rights to corporate rights. I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell our tens of thousands of viewers right now, maybe up to 100,000 by now, to tell folks, give the pitch on comparing women's rights under law to corporate rights under law.
Well, first of all, our organizers are passing out those leaflets in, beyond just Washington, D.C., in states across the country. So it's very exciting. And yeah, one of the things that really, really rubs me the wrong way and got me so outraged about corporate personhood is the fact that corporations were given constitutional rights and protections before women were recognized as persons by the Supreme Court. In fact, basically at the same time that women were agitating for the right to vote, but well before we were able to achieve the 19th Amendment, women made the case that the 14th Amendment, which denies us equal protection, or which guarantees us, equal protection of the laws, which was passed to ensure the protection of folks who had been enslaved, women made the case, well, when states have laws that keep us from voting, obviously the laws are not being applied equally, and the 14th Amendment should protect our right to vote, and made the case. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to you. You're not persons, according to us.
So
You're
I
chattel
just got to
property.
stop you, Caitlin, to really underscore for viewers. So the Supreme Court of the United States said in a case called Minor versus Epperset, no, women are not persons for the purposes of the 14th Amendment.
Exactly, exactly. And that was a moment where the Supreme Court could have actually opened the door, and we wouldn't have needed an amendment to guarantee women a right to vote, because they could have defined women as persons, and then we would have opened the door to us to the Constitution. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court isn't really an institution that is about furthering democracy and expanding access to the Constitution for people most of the time. And then on top of that outrageous position, just a few years later, the Supreme Court said that corporations can claim 14th Amendment protections, that for the purposes of the 14th Amendment, corporations would be considered persons. And so women don't have access to the Constitution, but corporations do. That's ludicrous. And then it took, decades more time for women to agitate. And, it didn't come easily. They had to stand outside in the freezing cold at inaugurations and perform civil disobedience, go on hunger strikes, be arrested, be beaten, lose their families over the right to vote because the Supreme Court refused to open the door to the Constitution for women. So that's just one example. And I already mentioned the Affordable Care Act and access to, birth control and contraception and family planning for women being part of what was intended under the Affordable Care Act. And the Supreme Court said that if corporations are owned by religious fundamentalists, then those corporations can be imbued with the religion of their owners, and the Affordable Care Act, they can be exempt from laws that the rest of businesses in the whole country have to follow, because the First Amendment applies to corporations. And there's other examples as well, but I know we don't have that much time. I encourage people to go to movetoamend.org, because the flyer is right on our front page.
Movetoamend.org to go deep on that particular flyer. But I do want to kick it to you, George, because when Caitlin was describing the fight for women just to be able to cast a ballot, which is horrific, one of the things that I've appreciated about Liberty Tree is the call to democratize elections. You've got a whole suite of demands that Liberty Tree is talking about to make elections more fair. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. And there we move, and thanks to Move to Amend, because we got to get the money out of politics no matter how the reforms go. And the reforms are multiple. Beyond voter ID, the Electoral College, ranked choice voting, proportional voting, voter suppression. There are many more that vary from state to state. And we have to move in that direction and work within the process of demanding of the politicians who are in place. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We have to get off the couch, and we have to move forward and build relationships and build power within our green power, so that we can get in the position to mediate, to negotiate, and to move the agenda forward.
So I really appreciate that idea, and I want to kick it back to you, Caitlin, to give a quickly, because you got it in briefly, but I was actually planning to give you a longer time to actually let folks know who may be inspired by the words, the actions. Tell us a little bit about how folks can get involved in Move to Amend, the organization.
Well, Move to Amend is a grassroots organization, and so the main way that people get involved is by starting a local group in their community, or getting involved in one of the dozens of groups that already exist across the country. So first step would be to go to movetoamend.org/map and look and see if there's a local group near you. What our local groups do is pass local resolutions calling on Congress to pass the amendment. We've done that in hundreds of communities and states across the country, over 700. Our local folks are out today petitioning like crazy, collecting signatures to bring in more people to our movement. We do a lot of education, because right now, obviously, it was sort of just brought home yesterday with the changing of the guard. But the reality is that we're far away from real democracy, kind of no matter who's in office, given the way that things have been in this country for many, many, many years. And so a lot of what we need to do is educate the American public. As George said, it's not a spectator sport. We need to get people involved. We do have our amendment introduced in Congress, House Joint Resolution 48. It will be reintroduced with this new Congress in the next couple months. But most of where we focus our attention is on the American public, because 80% of people agree that corporations should not have the same rights as people, and that big money should get out of politics. But obviously 80% of people don't believe that it's possible for us to actually amend the Constitution. And so that's where the rubber meets the road. That's our work. And it's very exciting. It's very exciting to start with that base of support, kind of no matter what community you go into, urban, rural, Black, white, Hispanic, coastal, in the middle of the country, doesn't matter. People agree. And so it's a great starting point for conversations about what a real democracy would look like in this country and what citizen power would look like in this country if we actually claimed ownership of our Constitution. And so I encourage everyone to come check out movetoamend.org and start to get involved.
Movetoamend.org is the portal. George, I'm going to give you the same opportunity for both Liberty Tree and the Wisconsin or the Green Party itself.
Check out our Liberty Tree website and get connected. Get connected locally, get connected to your local parties, get up off that couch, participate, talk with your neighbors, talk with your co-workers, get this discussion going. Let's move the public to affect the politicians, and if the politicians don't affect us, let's move them on out and grow up.
So I'm going to conclude with this, folks. You're watching Inaugurate the Resistance, a special broadcast of the Green News Network. I want to underscore something. The Stein-Baraka campaign and Move to Amend and the Progressive Independent Party and the Equality Coalition, the steering committee for Occupy Inauguration, were planning this participatory process when we expected that Hillary Clinton and the neoliberal agenda would be what we were fighting. So we are now fighting the neo-fascist agenda of Donald Trump. And so neoliberalism, neo-fascism, they both suck, right? But I want to be clear about something. The need to build a movement for peace, justice, democracy, and real ecology in this country, that's the work that we are trying to do here on the Green News Network. So if you have appreciated what you're hearing, share this with other people. Let them know that we, the people, are building our own institutions, organizations like Move to Amend and Liberty Tree, political parties like the Green Party. Now we are building our own damn network because, my concluding thought, we are coming for you. To the ruling elite, can't stop, won't stop. The truth will be brought to you by the Green News Network. Stick around, we'll be back. Peace.
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
We can have an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. The power to create that world is not just in our hopes, it's not just in our dreams. Right here and now, it's in our hands, in our hands, in our hands, in our hands.
When you've got so many voices, but only two choices is tragic. It's the intersection where deception is apparent. What's a generation facing global havoc when the catastrophe faced was caused by their parents? We're irresponsible. I gotta confess, I'm jealous. They got the party while we clean up the mess. I'm stressed, and yes, this is thinking selfishly. But what about me? I want a family, kids, that dog and picket fence. I want paid vacation, a commute that makes sense. I want a raise at regular increments. I might want it, but we don't need none of that. We need clean water, clean air, and health care. We need a legal system where justice is fair. We need a government that cares for its people. We need a country where all men are treated equal. We need integrity in public service and compassion in all who give service. We need a leader who works hard every day to make all of us a better tomorrow today.
It's time to stand up. We are the ones we've been waiting for. It's time to forget the lesser evil and fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do. Right here and now, it's in our hands, in our hands, in our hands, in our hands.
They say what's good for the goose is good for the gander, but with only two choices, don't believe the propaganda. Question DNC and that whole extravaganza, knowing that trickery had to have been the answer. Proudly bringing democracy, flying banners, spreading capitalism. Like cancer, the climates are changing. They say all is fine. They blow up women and children like it's not a war crime. Time for us to shift our paradigm, where we design our own storyline. Open up your heart and let your love shine, so we can see peace in our lifetime. If we consolidate and combine, we could be the strongest possible witness by mankind. And womankind is a sign, free your mind. Yes, we want a woman, that woman is Jill Stein.
We can have an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. The power to create that world is not just in our hopes, not just in our dreams, right here and now. It's in our hands, in our hands, in our hands, in our hands. It's time to stand up. We are the ones we've been waiting for. It's time to forget the lesser evil and fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do. We can have an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. The power to create that world is not just in our hopes, it's not just in our dreams, right here and now, it's in our hands. Thank you so much for making it so.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to our next panel discussion. We're going to be talking about local power and rebel cities and how do we build for system change in this emergency of the Donald Trump administration. With the inauguration speech yesterday, which was all about blaming foreigners in this country and blaming other countries for taking our jobs and our wealth and all of that. You know, this is more of what we expected, the demonization of victims, the effort to divide us at the international level and to divide us here within our communities, to separate off immigrants, people of color, Latinos, to fan the flames of xenophobia and racism and homophobia and anti-women and LGBTQ community. These are battles that are not new to us, but certainly people are feeling more vulnerable than ever. I think the good news, perhaps, is that Donald Trump's numbers are falling before our very eyes. Today, less than 1/3 of the American public is in support of his work thus far. He has managed to appoint something like 29 members out of 600 appointments that he needs to make in the executive office. So this is not exactly a functioning administration, and to have watched Mr. Trump and the First Lady during the inaugural activities, it looked like they were going to a funeral, that they had been absolutely shocked by what is not only that he got elected, but what's actually involved here. A man who's clearly not prepared for the job. So we have our work cut out for us, but in many ways we are well positioned right now with the most embattled president probably in modern history, who begins his job already in a minefield, really mired in a minefield of legal, ethical, and constitutional violations. A president who is likely to be hogtied from the start with all sorts of challenges to practically every move that he makes. Nonetheless, we are needing to stand up strong now more than ever on so many accounts. And there have been such wonderful things that have happened at the local and community level, particularly with the work, Shama, that you've done, which has been so inspiring in passing a local ordinance in Seattle for living wages, which then triggered a whole flood of living wage ordinances around the country. And work, I would mention, in the Green Party with local elected officials like Gail McLaughlin, who, as mayor of Richmond, California, established some major policies, both changing how police respond to violence, taking a much more proactive, peaceful intervention strategy, taking on the big banks, actually turning eminent domain on its head to actually use it against the big banks when homes were threatened with foreclosure, and also to improve local employment, to tax local corporations. Yeah. There are so many things that we can do when we are in charge. I'll mention also the mayor of New Paltz, New York, Jason West, was the first elected official to begin officiating over gay marriages, LGBTQ marriages, and in fact went to jail for a few days as a consequence. So there is so much that we can do at the local level, both by way of supporting social movements, the movement, for example, to provide sanctuary cities and to refuse to cooperate with ICE and with the national and county level law enforcement that Donald Trump is planning to mobilize to deport 3 million immigrants. We can stand up on behalf of our vulnerable brothers and sisters at the local level on movement work, and we can also do that even more powerfully when we're being elected to positions like local sheriff, city councilors, mayors, and so on. So we have two wonderful guests here today. Shama Sawant, who I mentioned before, the serving city councilor in Seattle, who's been very active in Socialist Alternative for, I think, a lifetime. And also with us is Tim Canova, who is a professor of law at Nova Southeastern University in Florida, and who is perhaps most renowned for challenging Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the recent Democratic Party primary. So, Tim, would you like to just kick us off with your thoughts? What can we do at the local level now?
I liked what you had to say. It's a very nice note of optimism in a way. I can't help thinking there's so much that local can't do. And I know that's not an optimistic note, but when you take a look at the conditions that brought Trump to power, and I think that Bernie Sanders rode for a while, and that I think animated your campaign, there's a real employment crisis in this country. And I'm not quite sure there's anything local government can really do about that. Local government is quite often responding to the effects of this persistent, chronic, and often hidden unemployment and underemployment problem. Now, raising the living wage is a great response to that, though. And we've seen the Fight for 15 in my area, in South Florida. And it's brought together labor unions, it's brought together activists, Greens and progressives, and it's been wonderful to see.
That's true. Yes, great. And good points. You know, I would just add that there's a lot we haven't been able to do at the national level economically, even before Trump.
Well, and that's where the fault lies, actually, when I talk about an employment crisis.
Great. And, you know, to that point, I would also just mention that, you know, there are options, for example, for initiating a local income tax. And a steeply graduated income tax, too. So there are ways, and in fact, before the New Deal was created in the 1930s, there were local initiatives towards a Green New Deal. And you're right, we can't solve it all, but you know, we can at least get the charge going and build from there.
And there's another thing that is happening at the local level, and I think it's very important, and this is the public banking movement.
Yes.
You know, you see that with the Bank of North Dakota, and now I know out in California there are a number of areas, including Oakland and I think Mendocino County, and I know in Pennsylvania they're shooting for this. In a lot of states around this country, public banking is a good solution. It's a good step in the right direction. I should say the Bank of North Dakota, which is the model, unfortunately, it comes out, has been helping to fund DAPL, right, the Dakota Access Pipeline. So at least, though, by being a public bank, it's accountable to public opinion on that. And I think the problem there in North Dakota is that public opinion, unfortunately, has been siding with the fossil fuel industry.
Great, good points. Shama, jump in. Tell us your experience here.
Well, thank you for organizing this discussion. I just would like to note for all our viewers, I mean, we're having this discussion in this at this venue, and just outside all the 500,000 marchers in the March for the Rights of Women are passing by after a whole you know, phenomenal day. It's a historic day. And you mentioned the approval ratings, Jill, and they are plummeting. And I thought Tim raised an interesting point about, you know, should we have a note of optimism or should we be in despair? And I think there's both. There's both in the air. And I think that the fact that you had a historic day of marching, and if you went to the crowds, you can see that many of them are young people, very young people, young millennials, for whom this might have been the first protest march ever. And what a march to have for your first protest march, which is, you know, you always remember that all your life. But my point is that on the one hand, it is actually it is a material setback having Trump being elected to office. But on the other hand, I think it is happening at a unique historic moment where starting from the Egyptian Revolution, the public sector uprising in Wisconsin, the Occupy movement, all the fights for 15, all of this is trending towards a time when entire generations of American people are refusing to accept the status quo, and that is going to go for Trump as well. I mean, they're not accepting the already existing status quo of corporate-dominated politics and deep inequality. They're certainly not going to accept all of that plus a dose of racism, xenophobia, and you know, just disgusting misogyny. So there's really a mood of rebellion amongst young people, and that is, I think, really going to be critical in terms of how we go forward. And I wanted to bring in a note of our experience in Seattle. I mean, the question of local politics versus national politics, I think posing that question is useful in one way, because it just from the standpoint of resources, building movements at the local level for local change obviously is often more tractable, more doable than on a national level. But I wanted to bring in another aspect that sort of transcends which level it is at, which is that if you have parties that are primarily representing the interests of corporations, of big business, of big landlords, then regardless of whether it's local or national, the kind of fight back you need to build is a grassroots activist fight back of young people, students, regular working people, renters, low-wage workers, who, as our experience showed in Seattle in the Fight for 15, have to defy not only big business that was dead set against even this minimum improvement in the lives of working people, but all the corporate Democrats who primarily represent the interests of big business, even though they, you know, sometimes try to play both sides. And I mentioned that not because I think we should draw false equivalence between Democrats and Republicans. I think Trump is an especially repulsive representation of our capitalist system. I think we should not lose sight of that. But on the other hand, if we are trying to figure out what is the kind of fight back we will need in order to actually defeat Trump and not just be against Trump, but actually push back against him successfully. And I think that will require a movement-based approach. And the question is, are the existing political parties going to offer that movement-based approach, or are they just simply going to say, well, we'll just wait for the midterm elections because we're not as bad as Trump, so people will elect us? And do we have a choice to wait that long? Because look at what he's already done, right? The White House website has wiped out the disability references. They wiped out the climate change directives. This is ominous. And they're going to go after labor unions. The public schools are in the crosshairs. So I think both the times we live in where people are wanting to fight back and also the urgency that people feel will push people into understanding that we need to build movements from below and not wait for politicians to do it.
Say a couple of words, because a lot of people out there are wondering, who have not yet become active and are looking for how to become active. A lot of people look to Seattle as an example of where this grassroots coalition got built at the city level, and you were running for office based on living wages and probably rights of renters as well. Right. And you went to fight, and building your campaign was basically about building that fight. Talk a little bit about that intersection between running for local electoral office and building a movement with a specific objective as you do so.
I think you bring up a very important point. Actually, we won, the city won the $15 minimum wage in June 2014, and we had won our first campaign for city council, Socialist Alternative, with me running as a candidate in 2013. And as you said correctly, Jill, we made the Fight for 15 the sort of the most prominent aspect of our campaign banner in 2013. And when we started that, the corporate media, the local political pundits, the local Democratic Party politicians, they all had written us off. They were like, there's no way they're going to win 15. One Democratic mayoral candidate famously or infamously even said that, well, workers are presumptuous to think that they deserve 15. And yet we ended up winning it. And I think the fact that we ran an electoral campaign, but not in service of a candidate, but in service of the movement, with a campaign and an organization, Socialist Alternative, that is completely tied to and loyal to the movement, that was what was different than any other electoral campaign. And because of that, we won, because people wanted that. And then when we won on the city council is what led us to win the $15 minimum wage as well. And I don't mean just because I got installed we won it, but my point is that by having a truly working class representative on a government body allows the movement to use that position, just like we used my position, to build the 15 Now campaign, to build a grassroots action that really provides a contrast from what people have on offer usually from elected office. Usually you don't have elected office that's actually fighting to build a movement. And that's the kind of example I think we provided. We need more of that, where we can have elected office really working to empower movements.
Yes.
My campaign, in some ways, the way was described was the opposite, in that we drew on all of these movements that were already formed. I got into my campaign from being part of the anti-Trans-Pacific Partnership movement. A lot of Fight for 15s came to our campaign. Environmental movements, the Bernie Sanders movement that he ignited, Green Party movement. So it was, it's not just my campaign. I think what we're seeing is a movement of movements coming together at a critical moment. Everything's hitting a critical mass. Environmentally, things are at a tipping point. It's that perception, for good reason, which leaves people impatient, especially this younger generation, for a lesser of two evils kind of a politics.
And you mentioned that you are now working on a new organization, and is that what this is about? Is your Is your focus now building movement, this movement of
very
movements?
issue oriented,
Mhm.
and it's called Progress for All.
Mhm.
Folks can go to progressforall.org, and we took the energy that had collected around my campaign to keep the organization going. So the TPP was one of the first issues we were going to start working on, but that's dead, fortunately. Didn't get through the lame duck Congress. But right now, the environmental issues in Florida have reached such a critical point. You know, the fracking has not been banned yet, and at the same time, they are building the Sable Trail Pipeline, which I'm beginning to call the Sinkhole Trail Pipeline. It goes through sinkhole country. It's a $3 billion pipeline, 500 miles. It's to transport 1.6 billion gallons of fracked gas a day. Now, all that has to happen is for a sinkhole to open at some point. And this is a pipeline that goes through beautiful areas, the Suwannee River, the Crystal River, the Santa Fe River, but it's also an aquifer for 60% of the state's drinking water. And we start seeing water companies that are in league with the fracking companies now. This is how perverse it's getting. There's such a callous disregard for whether the aquifer gets polluted at some point, if it gets contaminated. There's always a profit motive in there for one of these interests.
Yes.
So our group, Progress for All, has been working very hard to bring attention to the Sable Trail issue. And you got a lot of folks who are camping out. There's half a dozen camps along the Suwannee River. This is Florida's Dakota Access Pipeline. And every state has a DAPL at this point, a standing rock.
Exactly. Beautiful. I'm being told that we are about out of time, but fortunately, we have a lot of, what should we say, time coming up and in the coming weeks and months that we can continue this conversation. This work is just getting launched. And, you know, Shama, thanks to you for providing for so many people a model of how we dig in locally. And Tim, thank you for fighting the beast and for actually, you know, finding incredible local traction now, you know, because you may be working with existing movements, but by bringing them together and focusing right at people's doorstep where this threat is really low, you know, it's their water, you know, it is, you know, it's public safety, it's everybody's climate and all that, but, you know, it's very exciting, and these are just wonderful and inspiring examples, I think, for everybody. You know, and in my view, it's not just a choice between optimism and despair. It's really about defiance, you know, and it's deciding that we're the ones who are going to be deciding. You know, it's about empowerment. You know, and empowerment takes us above hope, in my view, and really above optimism and above despair and depression, which can be quite disabling. When we're empowered, you know, then we are unstoppable. In the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. And as we discover how much power we have, it just magnifies that power that we have.
You know, yesterday at the inauguration, I was at a counter inauguration. One of the signs that was so great was "Take the path of most resistance." And you inspire folks that way, Jill.
Well, thank you so much, as you all do. Thank you. To be continued. Thanks a lot.
Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Inaugurate the Resistance. I'm Mel Figueroa, press director for the Stein Baraka campaign, and now executive producer of the Green News Network. And I'm proud to be bringing to you today my conversation with Jordan Cheriton of the Young Turks and TYT Politics. Hello, Jordan.
Hey, how are you?
Great, great. And I'm so glad to have you here because I really think it's important that we have a conversation about the media and, you know, the role that the media has, and should play in the times ahead. So, in a recent article, Tom Hartman actually really took the media to task for, in part, creating Trump as a media phenomenon, saying that the media, quote, sacrificed democracy for ratings. So let's talk a little bit about the media landscape that we find ourselves in. You know, I'd love to talk about it both from your experience as an independent media reporter and from mine as someone who was really trying very hard to get our message through to the American people through the mainstream media blackout in this bitter, especially in this bitter and divisive election. So how do you think the media played a role in the disaster we now know as President Trump?
Well, I think that having worked in cable news for a couple horrific years, I worked at Fox and then MSNBC, so I've had the belly of the beast of both extremes. You know, cable news and broadcast news is a dying industry. It's bleeding younger viewers. Obviously, younger viewers are coming to the Young Turks, are coming to Democracy Now!, independent media, because young people could smell BS, and young people can also identify what's authentic. So really, cable news and broadcast news, we're looking for a sugar high. What can get ratings now to keep us in survival mode? Because that's what they are. I mean, I think CBS's president, Les Moonves, said Donald Trump is bad for America, but he's great for CBS. And I think that really says enough. There's a lot of reasons why Trump is president, but I think a lot of it is the 30-year demolition between trickle-down economics and radical conservatives, neoliberals that weren't much better, created this groundswell of just hopeless, angry people in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida. We could go down the list. But let's not make a mistake. Donald Trump was elected because people got Donald Trump for breakfast. People got Donald Trump for afternoon snack. People got Donald Trump for lunch. People got Donald Trump for dinner, for midnight snack. You could not go anywhere and not hear about this man. And you know what? The bottom line is, I traveled the country. I don't mean this in a malice way, but there's a lot of uninformed people in the country. So when they put on CNN or they're reading, online or reading a paper, and all they see is this man, it just drilled him into the national zeitgeist. And obviously the candidate running against him didn't help. And the bottom line is, when you let somebody call in from their bed to your programs, when you don't challenge someone who is saying things that are frankly quasi-fascist, also you keep your ratings going, you help create that. I don't think he's a fascist, but I think he's pretty close. And I think that's how we got here.
Yep. And now we are here. And in post-election and post-inauguration, the landscape indeed looks bleak. I think part of it is that, people, like you said, people are suffering, and people have, they need an explanation. And I think the purpose of narrative is really important. And, when they don't get that explanation, when they don't get, the things that really speak to their condition, then they're suspect and they're susceptible to demagogues and all of these and other types of explanations that may not have the desired effect and what actually really brings benefits back to them. And I'm really concerned about this because we have a extreme consolidation of media in this day and age, and going along with that, we have the development of what I think are these gigantic echo chambers that from the two-party system. There's both of them on the Republican and Democrat side. So on Trump's end and the Republicans, you have Steve Bannon on one side, and on the other you have David Brock working for the Clintons. And especially in this time period, you get these sort of accusations of fake news, right, flying everywhere, especially with the Washington Post that of course published their list of quote fake news, which included a lot of independent media and progressive media outlets. It's almost like a process of enclosure that we're seeing, that just is consolidating these two like fake explanations of what's going on and preventing other perspectives, other narratives, other viewpoints to get through. So, I wanted to ask you, sort of what your experience of this is, as somebody who, who I think is an honest reporter and somebody who's, trying to get the truth out, and, how, just the difficulty of being able to do
First of all, the fake news mantra is bullshit. Sorry to curse. Let me tell you something. When perfect example was Obama's press conference yesterday, his final press conference. I don't remember the name of the journalist, but the first question he said, and considering the ties between WikiLeaks and between the Russian government and WikiLeaks, and he just said it as if it was fact. as if it's a known fact that WikiLeaks got its information on Hillary Clinton's campaign emails and all that from the Russian government. And to President Obama's credit, actually, he actually answered, well, we have not confirmed that. But that's just one example in an endless stream all day long. You have journalists at papers that are supposed to be like the paper of record or the most trusted news network. They've become kind of Pez dispensers for the powerful, in my opinion. They just report without critical eye what unnamed officials tell them. Well, you know, I didn't take a lot of journalism classes. I think that's actually a good thing because I think they teach you a lot of backwards things. But like my default setting is they are lying to you. And some might say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist or you're cynical. But the bottom line is most of the government intelligence systems, by nature, they're liars. The CIA are spies. They lie for a living. The FBI's got a lot of liars. So, right. But I guess what I'm saying is, sure, is there fake news where literally people are making up fake stories and they're conning people? Sure. But I don't think that's the more dangerous news. I think the more dangerous news is news coming from the, so-called mainstream media that is literally regurgitating talking points from intelligence officers or politicians as if it's fact. I'll give you a perfect example. This actually hurt Bernie Sanders. You had all these people going on national television and saying as if it was a fact that chairs were thrown at the Nevada State Convention when there was zero video that there were chairs thrown at all. You had Debbie Wasserman Schultz go on TV and say there were chairs thrown. I'm sure Dr. Stein had plenty of things that were provably untrue, regurgitated. So the point is, there's fake news happening every day. But the worst kind of it is coming not from, people in their underwear putting stuff out on Facebook, but grown men in makeup, in a studio. And the second thing I'll say is, in my own experience, I went around the country for a year. I probably covered more Bernie rallies, more Stein rallies, Trump rallies than most people. And what was really discouraging to me when you want to talk about fake news is when I'm standing there and people around me, unarmed people, are getting shot at and getting grenades shot at them and tear gas and all this. And then you go back to your hotel later and you put on the TV and the news is, what did Donald Trump tweet? There's a real cognitive dissonance from human rights abuses going on or people being poisoned in Flint and now Indiana. And when you put on the TV, it's tweets and the food fight between Ted Cruz and Donald Trump or Melania and, just nonsense. And until that changes, we're in trouble because I think Amy Goodman has said it many times, but without an informed public, you don't have a democracy.
Absolutely. And, again, that it is really dangerous because, any civics class, in your basic civics class, you're taught that, you have the three branches of government and then the media and an independent press is supposed to be the fourth estate. It's supposed to be the other branch that is supposed to keep our government honest and have those checks and balances, again, now we just see these propaganda arms of both parties that is supporting the corporate duopoly, and look where it's gotten us, right? And again, that's why I really need to express my admiration for TYT, for what you've done at Standing Rock, for standing up to Donna Brazil, and really being that voice of conscience, to be the conscience of government, which is what an independent press should be. So what do you think it would take to build up and revitalize independent media as this conscience of a democracy? What can people do to support these efforts?
Well, I think that going back to what I said in the beginning, the bottom line is it's really a matter of when. It's not if, it's when. Cable news, broadcast news, the New York Times, it's an older audience. I mean, Fox, they're on dialysis, those viewers. MSNBC, CNN, they're very old. I think what needs to happen is what we saw happen in the primary. I mean, I'm not saying it to be a homer for the Young Turks, but the Young Turks audience doubled. Why? Not because we were putting out propaganda, but because our values, we don't pretend to be, robot journalists, neutral, because I don't think you should be neutral as a journalist. I'm not going to be neutral to injustice. I'm not going to be neutral to corruption. That's not the role of a journalist. The role of a journalist, they're teaching you now in journalism school, is to just say, this side says this side says this, we're too lazy to tell you who's lying, you figure it out. And that's not journalism. And that's what you're seeing. It's the he said, she said journalism. And like, we're just telling you what this side says. So climate change, there's people who say it's not true, so we have to give them a stage. No, you don't. The scientific evidence is in. There aren't two sides to the story. There's not two sides to most stories, actually. There's what people say, and then there's the facts. So the journalist's job is the facts. And where I think this needs to go, as much as Dr. Stein and Bernie Sanders inspired people to run for office themselves, I'm seeing a lot of people who have been inspired to become journalists themselves, and not the kind that need to go waste money, $200,000 in debt to get like a Columbia J School degree that will end up getting you at CNN to propagate fake news. I'm talking about the kind, all you got to do is get a monopod or hold it yourself and go to a rally or go to a local PTA meeting in your school. I have found stuff, honestly, literally putting up my phone while online watching at the movie theater. I have found questionable injustice. And in the beginning, you don't need to worry about how many viewers you get. If you keep at it and you're in the right place at the right time and you stay consistent, all you need is a heartbeat, a phone, and some ethics. And I think that's where we're going, whether it's, obviously I was very lucky. I was lucky enough to get an opportunity with the Young Turks. There aren't many independent media outlets, but I think the more people, activists who take it upon themselves to become a citizen or independent journalist, there's going to be more Young Turks. There's going to be more Green Party TV. There's going to be all sorts of things we're not even seeing yet, because it's not if, it's when. Young people are what the advertisers want. Advertisers want young people watching their content, not old people who what they spend money on is, the 5 o'clock Chinese buffet. So I think really it's as much as it's a people's movement when it comes to politics, it's the same thing with journalism.
Absolutely, and I think Facebook Live has played such a great part in facilitating this and making this happen. And again, I really am telling viewers that what you can do is be the media, right? You can be the media, just like you're doing, just like Young Turks has done, and I thank you so much for doing this, and again, thank you very much for joining us today. Can
I say one last thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't hear this talked about a lot, but with Donald Trump being inaugurated, there was always this talking point: we can't normalize Trump's racism, right? Well, I think the media has normalized things that are human rights abuses. So when the media does not cover a 21-year-old girl having her arm nearly shot off, unarmed. When the media doesn't cover a Native American woman having tear gas shot in her face by police, unarmed, she now lost her eyesight. When the media stops covering citizens literally, either getting brain damage, some of them dying from bacteria infections in Flint, this becomes normal. It becomes normal for public institutions like the police department to assault unarmed people. And that's not normal. That's against the law, right? So again, same thing with Flint. It's not legal to poison your citizens and then turn a blind eye. And the fact that our media is now a pretty much kind of like this echo chamber horse race box that covers Donald Trump's tweets and, the food fight between the Democratic establishment and whoever. A lot of things that are against the law and human rights violations are becoming normalized. And that's why I'm going to do everything I can to keep exposing it and get it out there. And everybody does, because if you allow these things to be normalized, if you allow peaceful protests in America to become something where you could get killed and there's no one held accountable, or you could lose your eyesight, or you could lose your arm and there's no one held accountable, then we're not a democracy. We are pretty much third or fourth world at that point.
And that's right. And again, thank you so much for everything you do and for inspiring people to be the media. So thank you so much again for joining us, Jordan.
Thank you.
Welcome back, folks, to the Green News Network presents Inaugurate the Resistance. We are in the home stretch. We've been at it for 6.5 hours, and we ain't done yet because the movement ain't done yet. You know how we'll know we done? When we have dismantled a white supremacist capitalist system and built a peaceful, just, democratic world. So we're going to talk about how to actually get there. This segment, from oligarchy to democracy, how the 99% can win. I've got Yane Indigo, longtime activist, went from Bernie or Bust to the Jill Stein and now the Green Party. I've got Eric Bloss of the Progressive Independent Party. I've got Richard Monhay by Skype, a union leader with Workers United. I'm going to put it to you, Yane. What's the plan? How can we actually take the system we're in and build the one that we want? How do we win?
Well, I think the most important thing that I'm feeling right now within the context of today and this weekend, with all of these people coming together, and a lot of it being about protest and there being a lot of contention, I think that we have to move past. Like, we've had a very contentious election process, and it's been very divisive, and we have a divisive kind of process as it relates to, how the government and our government and leaders drive us against each other. And I think that it's really important for us to move towards transcending that. And that's like, before any of the other stuff, like, there's a lot of organizing that we can do. There's so much that we have to do, but we're not going to be able to do anything that's substantial if we continue to work in blocks and we continue to act like we have, us working against each other is going to create anything. So, for example, I was telling Erica earlier how we were hanging out earlier and we ran into a bunch of Trump supporters, and and I went over there and we had conversations, we hugged it out, and people were upset about it, but then we hugged it out bigger and we hugged it out more, and we started talking about where do our struggles intersect. We have to get to that point when we as the people recognize that we are each other's allies and that our allegiance is the most important thing. We have to separate and let go of the parts where we disagree and focus on the reality that our basic rights have to be established before we can start fighting and talking about anything else. Then we build movements, then we build organizations and systems that support that process of us coming together and being a bigger voice than that of the oligarchy.
So, Richard Monhay, I'm going to bring in you because as a union leader, historically, we have seen that organized labor has been the countervailing force to the oligarchs who are in control of both of the two major political parties. What is your sense of the prospects for organized labor in this historic moment?
I think in this historic moment, the trade union movement is, every time we've gone through the concessions or we've gone through sort of epoch-changing events in manufacturing or industrialization, it's put pressure on the trade union movement to react. And every time we've reached this pinnacle or these kinds of pinnacles, the trade union movement has refused to sort of transition and adapt to the new environment of what's happening in this country and the world. And certainly during NAFTA and the formation of the Labor Party, there was a potential and there was a breakout of the traditional sort of trade union Democratic Party politics that lasted maybe 3 or 4 years after NAFTA passed. I think there's no doubt that we're facing in the trade union movement and everywhere else for that matter, a real challenge of whether or not we're going to be able to have a vision of what the world can look like under the present circumstances, under the present technological development and its application to work, and to see if we, the union movement, as well as working class people, can transition into some kind of view of what the world needs to be like for today and tomorrow, and not what the world was like yesterday. And unfortunately, the trade union movement continues to try to recreate some kind of alliance with capitalism that will guarantee a role for them to play within the stabilization of capitalism and all the social consequences that it creates to communities, to various sectors of the working class, like Black Lives Matter, the women's movement. But I think this challenge is really incredible in terms of the pressure it's putting on for the trade union movement to begin to develop a cadre-type organization with leadership development that is able to understand and participate in the creation of the next stages of development of this country. And there's no way that we can do it, I think, inside of the Democratic Party itself. There are people that need to struggle in there, and there are people that need to struggle outside of it. But it's clear that the union movement, at least a sector of it, got to set the example and got to strike out in the direction of creating the kinds of alliances that are necessary to build a real working class movement, absolutely integrated with all the social expressions of the frustration and anger of various sectors of the working class, be it the African American community, be it the Latino community, or all the immigrant communities that are moving into this country. So it's quite a challenge, but I think it starts with educating the members and building a real base of support for the kinds of decisions that trade union leaders got to make at this critical juncture.
Richard, thank you so much for that. One of the things that I think is really important, you and I actually knew each other a little bit, at least during the formation of the effort to form the Labor Party. And I remember having arguments with Tony Mazzocchi about how if we don't run candidates for office, we can't actually challenge the capitalists. And so I'm going to actually take the ownership of the fact that the Green Party's position on running candidates was the right one, but we did not do a good enough job of educating our own members about white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism. So I own being both right and wrong at the same moment when I had those arguments with Tony Mazzocchi. I want to bring in Erica Bloss, who is the founder and executive director of the Progressive Independent Party, ask her the same question. From oligarchy to democracy, what's your strategy for actually achieving that?
Well, first, thank you for having me here. I'm thrilled and honored to be next to this beautiful lady. Our plan, or what we're calling for, we are a movement. We're calling for a coalition-based third party based on those things that we can agree on. We saw this happen in Standing Rock. We saw when we focus on the issues that we can agree on, uniting becomes very easy. So the overriding theme of what we're here doing in Occupy Inauguration and the summit this weekend is we're focusing on how do we unite through diversity, both in spite of differences and in celebration of our differences. Through diversity, we will have very many mechanisms to move the movement forward. So we're calling all third-party folks to come together and have a discussion on how we can have a coalition and move this country forward.
Yana, I want to bring you back into the conversation. I mean, the idea of hugging it out on an individual level, I mean, that seems well and good. Look, I'm related to people who voted for Donald Trump. I love them dearly, right? But my vision of the world that I want to get to in terms of the structure of society itself, I'll be honest with you, I don't see hugging it out with somebody on the street as a plan. So I'm not trying to be ugly about it. I'm trying to push you a little bit. What's the plan?
So, I mean, and I don't think of that as a plan. I think of it as an important step towards being able to actualize whatever plans we have, right? So, and it's not about hugging it out and saying, I agree with you. It's about remembering that we connect as human beings and that our mutual humanity is very, very important. For me, I do believe that it's really important to build the minor party movement in general, as you're speaking about. I believe personally in the importance of the minor of. And I use the term minor party instead of third party because I don't want to reinforce the idea of this two-party system, right? That we have a major party that could always become a minor party. They are becoming minor parties in this process as we're building up these minor parties that will be major parties. But I do believe explicitly in building up the Green Party. I think that the Green Party is very important as a national organization that's already established, that already has. It's on ballots. I mean, there's so much that comes with building up a national party. So starting over, I think, is something that people should really reconsider when we have something that's already been established, a place that's been held open for us for so long. And I believe very strongly in building up the Green Party and educating through the Green Party. I also believe in the project that I'm working on with a committee of people around the world It's called Ubuntu Nation. Ubuntu is a principle that that says there is no me without you. I am because you are. Recognizing that connection, again, is the foundation of the building of this international community. And we're building a framework for that, online framework, as well as a national communal framework in order to be able to impact elections and be able to work together to, when we have a problem, to take ownership of those problems and not keep pointing to government officials and saying, we need you to fix the Flint water crisis. It's about putting us in a position to be empowered to say, this is something that's important to us as an international community, and we're going to address it. And so, so Ubuntu Nation is something that people are going to be hearing more and more about, and it is completely intended to build exactly with that and work with an organization like the National Green Party, international Green Parties, in order to move from these ideas of our separations, to move from the ideas of our small communities, and to acknowledge and recognize our international communities, and that we have in all of those communities justice workers, and then those justice workers need to be working more collaboratively in order to make the transformation that we want to happen. We need resources to make that happen, and Ubuntu Nation will be a resource to help that.
Thank you, Yane. So I'm going to now go to you, Richard. Time is moving quickly, but so too is the emergence of fascism, because I want to be very honest. As somebody like you who studied, this moment is predicted. However, I'll be honest. Going from neoliberalism to neo-fascism was predicted. You know what I did not predict, nor was I ready for? How quickly it is actually emerging in this country. Nor was I ready for how effective it would be in taking over the political infrastructure of bourgeois democracy. So I'm going to ask you, Richard, do you share that sentiment? If not, what did I get wrong? What can we do as we are watching neo-fascism emerge in this country?
Yeah, I missed a little of, you were breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure what was going on, whether it's my internet or my Wi-Fi or just the Skype connection. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you great, Richard.
Okay, good. There's no doubt, David, that I think not just you, but many of us were surprised at how rapid the conversation, I think, in people's heads changed from, relative stability and accepting the concessions, the flatlining of wages, the foreclosure movement, the crisis in housing that was created by the cost of medical care, and what that impact would have on particular the former manufacturing and industrial base, and in particular in the Midwest, where our union is based out of, the fact that they were prepared to listen and open up around the economic questions, and were actually, I think, that open to coalitions. The problem is that those coalitions weren't presented. The solutions to those economic conditions were not met. But this is a pattern that of neglect of investment in working class communities that just didn't start in the last 10 or 15, 20 years. This goes back to Detroit. It goes back to the south side of Chicago, south central Los Angeles, Cleveland. All of these were former industrial areas of the country where largely African-American communities had a step, open to where they could begin. I don't think it was accomplished entirely, but begin to stabilize their communities, stabilize their families, and begin to be a part of the economic infrastructure of this country. And that basically stopped. And now that is spread to areas in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, the coal mining sectors. And in no way do we have a response to that when we're dealing with the neoliberalist politics and globalization and trade. But the ones that did step in were the fascists, and very quickly that they moved and they presented solutions to this. You can oversimplify this and try to focus on some of the principal characteristics that may have influenced the rapidity by which it's moved to fascism. But at the end of the day, the lack of political discussion, the lack of debate around the economic conditions and what that does to this country, and then deal with the social consequences of neglect of communities and the working class experience in this country. So now you have all these discussion about white working class and white workers, and but really the definition of what has happened in this country and the absolute domination of corporations, and the drive towards fascism under social consequences is the only way of maintaining control of this country. Moves so quickly. And I agree with you, Dave, that the question is, and as some of the young ladies reference this, is now we have to build coalitions as quickly as possible. Something that we should have taken our time, gotten experience, ran candidates, built party infrastructure that normally takes 20, 25 years to build up, from the municipalities all the way to a national movement and national campaigns with a program at its core. Now we have to do that in a relatively short period of time, and it's going to challenge us. It's going to challenge us, as people have already said, to break down those barriers, to break down the siloed character of the social movements in this country, and to try to build a hardcore, economic / social justice movement in this country that combines the interests of the working class as workers and the expression of discrimination, racism, and neglect of, whole communities all across this country. It's really quite a challenge, but in a very short period of time, we could have the state and the social and political infrastructure for fascism that would minimize our civil and human rights at the local level in a very brutal way. And we have to do everything we can to stop that.
And we are running up against time as well, but I want to turn to both Janne and Erikal for some quick closing thoughts, because it's true we have a challenge and very little time to do it. I'm going to put it to each of you in that same sort of way. What up? Closing thoughts.
Well, I just want to, what you're saying, I agree. That's one of the reasons why I just want to really, I really want to impress upon people my perspective that we do not have time to build new parties. I think it's really important for people to understand that it does take a decade, that process. You have to go through multiple elections to get on ballot access. This process takes too much time. We do not have the time now to try to start from scratch when we've got things that are already in place. If I believe in the Green Party, but if there's a different party that you connect to, establish yourself in one of the parties that are already here, aligned with our ideals, and then work together with the other parties through a coalition building process. That's a really important approach. We do not have time to decide to take the progressive movement and build something new, because people's lives are on the line. So I think it's really important to do that, to recognize the inside-outside strategies that people are talking about, but everything has to be strategic, and we have to come together, and we really have to come together across a lot of these boundaries in order to get to the basics of what we all need and build from there. And so I have friends. I hugged it out with Josh Fox, as we always do. We hugged, we love each other. I forgive him for voting. I forgive anyone for voting for Hillary Clinton. People may need to vote, may feel they need to forgive me for voting for Jill Stein. I feel very strongly and very happy about having done that, but I forgive people who voted for Donald Trump as well, because at the end of the day, we can't decide that we're going to judge everybody based on whatever the worst idea or the worst thing is, and we don't know what the reasons are that people did things. We have to figure out who in every circle is aligned with us and aligned with those on those things and work forward, or we're going to be battling against each other forever when we need to battle against the system. So that's just my
Erikal, I'm going to kick it to you with the same thing.
Okay, well, the three pillars of the Progressive Independent Party, which is a movement for coalition building, we're asking everyone to see the network in which the narrative is created, which has corporate media creating divisions between progressives and the right and left. And so the three pillars is the asking of the coalition for minor parties, but it's also asking for continued coalitions within social movements, economic movements, ecological movements, coalition building, in that fashion, and also in independent media. So when we're going to meet tomorrow, we're going to talk to people in independent media, people in the movement, and those in electoral politics to see how those three can impact the oligarchy. We got to be simultaneous, and we have to be aggressive. It's time we stop being defensive and start being offensive. So we need to be strategic, and we need to do it together.
So, this conversation went way too fast. I'm going to make it a point to have both Yane and Erikel and Richard on my show, Democracy in Action, here on the Green News Network, so we can actually go deeper with each one of you on this. I'm going to conclude with this, y'all. To be very clear, my assessment, and that is that principled liberals and progressives have been lied to and sold out by the ruling elite of the Democratic Party, who were taking their money and their marching orders from the corporatist, militarist, imperialists of Wall Street America and the big banks. But you know what? Yane brings up another interesting point. I'm going to say this. I think principled conservatives have been lied to and sold out by the ruling elite of the Republican Party, who were taking their money and their marching orders from the same damn corporations, big business, imperialist, militarist bankers that exist. See, they have convinced us to fight with each other over these issues, and we've lost sight of the question, who controls this country? Are we, the people, collectively going to have a process by which we can have the world that most of us want to live in or not? So, Richard, your point about doing political education in a hurry, let me tell you this, and all viewers. Through the course of this 7 hours, we reached over 900,000 people. You let that sink in a moment, right? Over 900,000 people heard a call for peaceful, nonviolent revolution in this country. So with that, I want to invite you to join us again on January 24th, an entire webinar called So You Want to Run for Office. Where? I'm glad you asked. On the Green News Network, yo. The Green News Network is going to bring you a webinar, So You Want to Run for Office, concrete tools on how to actually do that. I would be remiss if I did not stop and end with an acknowledgement of what we think of as the Green Team. Jill Stein and Ajamu Baraka, of course, are presidential and vice presidential candidates. But I also want to underscore there were literally hundreds of people, thousands of people who made that campaign work. But on the Green News Network, and today, Gloria Matera, George Friday, George Martin, Justin McCarthy, Julie Varghese, Mel Figueroa, Michael O'Neill, Mike Dennis. The list goes on, but the reason that I gave you those names is because most of those names were behind the camera. They never got a chance to actually be in front, but they spent 7 hours, actually 12 hours today, making all this work. So I want to give a special note of acknowledgement, appreciation, and real love and respect for what you did behind the things. Yeah, love and respect to all of you. We're out. We'll be back, though, the Green News Network. The revolution may not be televised, but we will bring it to you on this live stream. Peace, and we're out.